All right, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, and Uncle Sam here. Can you all hear me okay? Now, good. Finally, the audio is working. I apologize for that. Being from the 19th century, my expertise with equipment of a modern type isn't so good. And I had to have Friendly History show me, and you know he doesn't know what he's doing, but he showed me how to use the background, so the green screen, so I'm going to have to pick a nice American history background, he told me. He was very, very clear about that. A very happy 4th of July and 250th birthday of the United States. It is its semi-quincentennial, meaning it is halfway, semi meaning half, to 500 years. And I'm Samuel Wilson. Well, I was Samuel Wilson. I was the inspiration for Uncle Sam, who in the 19th century was a meat packer for the War of 1812, who stamped his initials U.S., Uncle Sam, United States, on the bottom of all the meat barrels he donated to the American war cause during the dreaded War of 1812. And of course, after that, Uncle Sam became the inspiration for the American mascot with his white beard and hat, probably most famously displayed during the famed, very, very famous World War, what friendly history calls World War II, the Great War, World War I, whatever you want to call it. And I was the one who was saying, I want you to join the U.S. Army, or I want you for U.S. Army. And I want you to like and subscribe and become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as all of that. We could use good friendly neighborhood historians studying and learning about history and loving history all day, every day, all types of history. But today, it's all the United States. It's all American history, and we're really looking forward to this Q&A. So I will be answering all of your questions about history and social studies regarding the United States of America for the next 2 hours, as we do every Saturday here at 3 p.m. Eastern, but it's usually only 1 hour, but we get 2 hours today. So I hope you really take advantage of that and enjoy it. And let's see here, 4th of July, good 4th of July background. Good 4th of July background. And if hopefully the audio is fixed. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me okay. Hopefully we're back on schedule. Let me see here. July 4th. July 4th. Don't seem to see anything. Friendly history isn't apparently that patriotic. Well, let's see here. Ooh, here's a good one. I know that July 4th is about the Declaration of Independence, but this is the Constitution, the other important document that Americans celebrate on September 17th. And of course, without these founding documents, America would not be the country it is today. So I'm here to answer all of your questions about history and social studies, and I'm so glad we finally got the audio working. Welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where usually it's History Hefner holding down the fort, but today he has transformed himself into Uncle Sam for your enjoyment. And I got all the good instructions about how to run this channel beforehand, so despite the fact that I'm over 200 years old, hopefully, actually, in some ways, I guess today is my 250th birthday being a mascot of the United States. And it's good to see everybody, all the friendly neighborhood historians. A happy birthday to the moderator, Harry, and show some love to Harsonet, the other moderator, who does a great job with the channel. And now that we've got the sound working, we are ready to go, answering all your questions about history and social studies. Sir, thoughts on the dirty British who just invaded Fort Detroit? Well, we put a stop to them, and that's what the British did during the War of 1812. Despite American desires to want to take Canada, which they've wanted to do for a long time, it's not something new, by the way, the British actually invaded using Lake Erie as their base of operations and attacked American forts at Detroit several years before Michigan became a state, by the way. That was during the War of 1812. We should enlist. I want you for U.S. Army. And hopefully the audio is coming in great. Can somebody give me a tech check? I do not have kidney stones, even though I am quite old. Please tell us why your lips are so amazing. Well, it's because I have good old American lips and not horrible, terrible, corroded British lips. And there's our social media handle there. You can follow us there for more social, all sorts of great history discussions like on the Discord and the Patreon. Let me see here. Mascot of the United States used to be Lady Columbia. True. Lady Columbia is, of course, the inspiration for the United States. Ben Franklin wanted the continent to be named Columbia, and of course, the capital is the District of Columbia, which is obviously based on Christopher Columbus, who discovered the Americas for the Europeans in the 15th century. Let me see here. Ooh, very good question from Mr. Quagmire. Yes, C. Why did it take so long for America to abolish slavery? Well, this is a very good question, and there's a lot of real details and stories behind it. It's not a very easy question to answer, but I'll do my best. Basically, a large portion of the United States owned slaves at the beginning, including many of the founding fathers. And even founding fathers that were against slavery, like Benjamin Franklin, realized that in order to create the more perfect union they desired, in order to declare their independence from Britain and be a successful country, one nation, united, all the 13 colonies, they needed to tolerate the institution of slavery, or else the southern states would never have gone along and joined. That is why the Three-Fifths Compromise happened. That is why a prohibition against slavery in the Declaration of Independence was actually banned by Benjamin Franklin. It was Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner, who impregnated one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, who tried to successfully insist upon condemning slavery as part of the grievance section of the Declaration of Independence against King George III. However, it was Ben Franklin, who had once owned slaves but was adamantly against slavery by that point in his life, who started the Abolitionist Society in Pennsylvania, who said that it would not be a good idea because it would lead to a divided nation, and you didn't want three different nations, and you didn't want a civil war right after ending the war with the British. So that's why the Americans had slaves. That's why they tolerated slavery despite touting the virtues of freedom and independence. A horrible inconsistency and a travesty, a stain on Americans' history that they fortunately revoked and did away with the Civil War despite much bloodshed that may or may not have been necessary when you think about all the countries in Latin America that freed their slaves without such issues. Would a question about the history of Mormonism be considered part of American history, or yes? Mormonism is part of American history, but I want to stay on U.S. history. I don't want to talk about religion today. I don't want to talk about geopolitics. I want to focus primarily on American history. And if you want to talk about the history of the Mormon Church as part of American history, I am willing to do that. For instance, the state of Utah was not granted entry into the United States because of a polygamy of a Mormon people. How do you think about the president, Rutherford Hayes? Very, very mediocre. Definitely wanted to achieve more than he did, and by ending Reconstruction basically gave up on trying to give African Americans their civil rights despite his own personal convictions that they definitely deserved total freedom. Why did George III want to keep the 13 colonies? Obviously, the 13 colonies was the base of operations at that time for the British in North America, and by keeping the 13 colonies, they could expand westward. They had western territories, what the Americans now call the Midwest, that they wanted to hold on. Obviously, it was a base of operations. They were considered loyal subjects, and they had had a good relationship going on with the British for 150 years. Yes, Samuel Wilson. I just made a video about him that you can check out after you're done watching this. Check out all the long, short, and live-form content we have for you about American history and otherwise. And of course, today we are doing exclusively American history, but we will be back with more, but there will be tons of other history available for you. We are going to be back to regular broadcasting on Monday, and every Q&A we usually answer questions about all different types of history throughout all the world. So if you're here for that, I'm sorry, you're going to have to enjoy the American history today. And yes, happy 250th birthday to the United States. Do you think it's accurate to say Marvel and DC heroes are American mythology? Yes, in a way you could say comic books are that way. Let me see. We honor one country, one anthem is real Americans, the Star-Spangled Banner. Talk about 1619, yes. 1619 has become a more popular and important date for Americans as they reflect upon the misgivings and failures of their nation. 1619 was when the first slaves were brought to the American colonies, the British American colonies at least, at Virginia. This was the start of slavery in the United States, a taint on America's legacy that lasted way longer than it should have for 250 years. And yes, everybody wants to talk about that. Very few people want to talk about how the United States ended slavery. The truth of the matter is, despite the horrors of slavery and the brutality that many people faced and were forced upon because they were slaves, the United States is one of the few countries in the world that actually went about abolishing it. And it abolished its slaves within a century of when it was first created, which is an impressive feat. Also, at the same time, the United States and most Western countries were the only societies to push for abolitionism and actually end slavery. The vast majority of the world was used to having slaves. In fact, the default question through Europe and North Africa and the rest of the world was, how do you treat your slaves? Are you cruel to your slaves? Are you kind to your slaves? Are you welcoming to your slaves? But the truth of the matter is, the question of abolitionism was a new and progressive idea that the Western world and the United States embraced wholeheartedly, although it took some time and some difficulty. But the truth of the matter is, large sections of Africa still have slaves to this day. There are more slaves in Africa today than there ever were in the Confederate States of America. But thank you for that good question. You just learned a lot of history, not just about the United States, but about the world, which is what we do. Let me see. Sir, was Abraham Lincoln too authoritarian? Was he right when he said, if I don't break one law, there will be no more laws to break? Who knows what would have happened if Lincoln had not suspended habeas corpus in 1862? But he was better safe than sorry, and I believe and trust Honest Abe did the right thing. Again, many American presidents have had to do this and have not been so forthright and honest, and nobody has received the heavy criticism that Lincoln received for suspending habeas corpus. So the truth of the matter is, although a lot of people really don't like Abraham Lincoln for doing that, and they want to poke fun and critique him for doing so, Lincoln said very appropriately that if I don't do this, there may be no more laws left to follow. And of course, the South had violated all of the laws of the Constitution by severing themselves from the United States. In 250 years of U.S. history, have there ever been an elected official who served well in person? Is this possible? Well, in prison? I'm going to do a video, Friendly History is going to do a video about Victor Berger, who was removed from Congress because he was indicted and put in federal prison. Nobody actually served in their office from federal prison, but Eugene V. Debs ran for president in 1920 as a socialist while in prison. And like I said, Mr. Victor Berger, the first socialist ever elected to Congress who helped form the Socialist Party in the United States with Mr. Debs, was elected to Congress in 2 different stints from Wisconsin, the most progressive state in the Union at the time. Just look at Robert M. La Follette, who ran for president in 1924, by the way. But Mr. Berger was forced to leave because he was indicted, and then they said that he could not be in prison because he had violated the Espionage Act, and that was a violation of his civil rights. So he's released from prison and allowed to serve in Congress again. Can you explain how did Mormonism come to be? Mormonism was started by Joseph Smith during the Second Great Awakening. There was religious revivals and social movements all throughout the United States, and a particular hotspot for this was upstate New York. Preachers like Charles Finney went to large crowds and did all sorts of incredible things to urge Americans to go back to their Christian faith. But some pseudo-Christian groups also developed with alternative theories about the end times or different theologies about Jesus of Nazareth, and one of them was the Mormons, who believed that Jesus was the one of many different gods, and that there were different truths of the Christian faith that turned out to be not truths, believing that they were restoring the original teachings of Christianity that had been lost after the death of the apostles. The Mormon church spread throughout New York, then Missouri, then Illinois, then Missouri, and eventually under the leadership of their second prophet, Brigham Young, settled heavily in Utah, where they are most well known today. Let me see. Why in Vatican City, not for the small... Okay. All right, then. Apparently, my own moderator does not understand that this is an American history Q&A only, and he's still sour because his country lost a war they should have won and were defeated by a bunch of rapscallion colonials with their French allies. You would have gotten away with it, too, if it wasn't for you meddling kids and your French allies. What is your thought on John Brown? The great abolitionist, kind of crazy, a little bit extreme. That wasn't the way to get slaves their freedom, but he was an exceptionally spirited man, and of course the Battle Hymn of the Republic is based off of him. Mr. Sam, thoughts on your cousin Sam I Am, Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss worked for the American government during the last World War to promote propaganda against the Japanese, creating extraordinarily racist depictions that later inspired his characters in his many stories about the Who's. When will Americans admit the British did a tactical retreat and were not beaten with pitchforks? The British lost the war because of the French. That is the simple answer to the question. Teddy Roosevelt versus race is amazing. Look it up. I'll have to look that up. Thank you so much. Let me see. The significance of the Dred Scott decision. Didn't Judge Taney overturn it? Well, Taney is the one who made the Dred Scott decision. Now, Taney had served in Andrew Jackson's cabinet as the Secretary of Treasury and then became a Supreme Court justice. And Taney was a Southerner who had owned slaves, who believed it was time to make a strike against the Union and the North on behalf of the slaves, to insult the abolitionist movement. Dred Scott was a slave whose master had moved from a slave state to a free state. Because he had moved to a free state, Scott had sued for his freedom. His master actually ended up giving it to him. But Taney and the Supreme Court, hoping to side with the South, said that his slave was not a citizen, and therefore he could not sue in court, therefore he remained a slave. It was a horrible violation of the free states, and many in the North believed that basically that meant that slaves could be brought anywhere. It horrified the Union, divided the nation, and brought us ever closer to the Civil War. Let me see here. No to taxes to support everyone else until we get rid of... Okay. We're not going to be talking about politics. We're going to be talking about American history. If James Garfield wasn't shot, do you think he would have been a good president? Yes. He was committed to ending the patronage system and the spoil system and would have been a very good president. Was George Washington a smart military commander or just a hard-working one? Hardworking and smart when he needed to be. Valley Forge is a good example of this. The crossing of the Delaware against all odds were good examples of this. Washington did what he needed to do when he had to do it, and he proved through his tenacity, his willpower, and his humility to be exactly the kind of leader the American people needed, both then and later. Happy 4th of July to everyone, and happy 250th birthday to the United States. And we are celebrating the semi-quincentennial at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel with Uncle Sam as our special guest, answering all your questions about history and social studies a la the United States. With its 250th birthday, 200 years to another 250 more years. I don't have anything to drink in my hand, so I apologize. Did Taft actually get stuck in a bathtub? Nope, highly exaggerated, but people would sometimes help him up. You are what I imagine a stereotypical American to be. Exactly. So you've stumbled upon a U.S. history channel. Well, actually, it's a history channel in general. You'd be amazed how much history we know about that's not American. With an American, dressed in an American suit, with an American accent, celebrating with his red, white, and blue bow tie and suit, as cosplaying as Uncle Sam with the Constitution in the background. I'm surprised there's not bald eagle noses in the background and Betsy Ross running across the background. So there you go. Let me see here. Did you know that Jackson was slashed by a British officer for refusing to shine his boots? Yes, Andrew Jackson had a particularly difficult childhood. He had to watch his family die and then came to hate anyone who opposed him. Very, very territorial individual. Lincoln had no right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. He violated the Constitution. He was in the middle of a war. Can you name me a president who did not violate the Constitution in the middle of the war? Do you understand the difference between the wartime and peacetime? Do you think Lincoln would have done that if the Union wasn't divided and about to be torn asunder? Thank you, Handy Andy. I didn't know you were Canadian. It's supposed to be an American accent from the 19th century. This is what I imagine a character like Uncle Sam would sound like. Brave and exciting and energetic. Do we have freedom from Israel? I don't know. Why are you talking about Israel? This is about America. Oh, good to see you, Seth. It's been a long time. Join our Discord. And yes, subscribe to the Patreon for more bonus content and join our talks on Discord. Hello, Yusuf. Good to see you. The United States had the guilt of slavery, but it shouldn't have, because the United States history technically started after the Civil War. The United States, it came to be after the War of Independence, is not the United States. No, but every nation has changed significantly in the last 2.5 centuries. So that's not a fair thing to say. The United States is born on July 4, 1776. What is your opinion on Andrew Jackson? Great president for the time period, would be a terrible president by today's standards. If you put him into any other context, probably wouldn't work out quite the way you think he would with his $20 bill. Let me see. Happy 4th of July to you too, Joseph. Good to see you. Who are some presidents who would have been pretty good if they didn't die killed in office? Kennedy, obviously. We also have Mr., as I mentioned, James Garfield. Who knows how good William Henry Harrison would have been? And Zachary Taylor is kind of a wild card. We don't know enough about these presidents to actually judge them correctly. Do you think between the 45 presidents of the U.S., was there ever a president who was not a Christian but just pretended to be a Christian? I don't know, and I don't really care. I'm getting tired of the religious questions from you. There probably are several presidents. Lincoln did not belong to a religious affiliation. Jefferson was a deist, and Washington was not a member of a particular denomination. But definitely all understood the importance of a Christian moral people. But again, I want to focus on history, not on religion, like you always do. Uncle Sam, what do you think of the First Amendment? How can we protect it? The First Amendment is an incredible, incredible idea. And it is an ideal that can be upheld by the actions of the American people. But it is just that, an ideal. People need to put action into words, pen to paper, in order to actually uphold the Constitution. It doesn't mean anything without the U.S. military being able to defend the country. It also doesn't mean anything without the citizenry being willing to understand and learn about it and apply it in proper context. The First Amendment guarantees 5 basic freedoms that seem like guarantees today, but were not so in 1787. The right to a freedom of assembly, people gathering together. Every single one of those rights was something they believed the British had violated during the American Revolutionary Movement. They also believed that people should be able to freely gather, assemble, petition their government for changes and revocations. They believed in the freedom of press to say what it needed to say and not be suppressed by an overriding governmental narrative. They believed in the freedom of speech in order for people to share different ideas, no matter how unpopular they might be. And they believed in the freedom of religion, that no established religion would control the United States, only people who were willing to worship God in any way they saw fit. And yes, despite the fact that not all of the founding fathers and not all of the U.S. presidents were Christians, the vast majority of them understood the importance and need for a Christian society and a moral people, as John Adams said. Can you elaborate on JFK's attempt to implement the silver standard? I'm not 100% sure about what he did. Obviously, it didn't go far. Kennedy was looking into financial reforms for the United States before he was assassinated. Let me see. How did schools start doing the Pledge of Allegiance? Can you do the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist Baptist pastor, now that we've gotten all the patriotism out of the way, a man known as Francis Bellamy in 1892. There had been previous pledges that were pushed on American school students. Part of it was the creation of the public school system, which was encouraging people to be and act more American, especially immigrants from other parts of the world, which were coming in mass droves at the end of the 1800s. Mr. Bellamy's pledge tried to unify all of these people, encourage them, and sell flags for a publication he was pushing during the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival to the United States, or to the Americas, in 1492. The 400th anniversary being in 1892 was when the pledge was released. It was just in time for the Columbia World Exhibition, which celebrated Columbus and America in Chicago, the World's Fair of 1893. Which is also famous because of the serial killer H.H. Holmes and his Hotel Hell. It's also famous because that's where the Ferris wheel debuted. There's a lot of great history around the Columbia's World Fair. Anyways, somebody should do a video on that. I wonder who. But anyways, yes, the Pledge of Allegiance enshrined certain values and ideals. It became popular in schools and was a way to unify people, particularly younger people, around the concepts and ideas of America, regardless of where they came from, what their background, creed, or racial makeup was. Lincoln played the electric guitar before electricity. Oh, that's funny. Let me see. We do have Discord. Because if it were in America, then Israel wouldn't have their hands up. Okay, whatever. Can we talk about the history of the United States? I don't want to talk about current geopolitics or people's personal obsessions with a very tiny country in the Middle East that is very far away from Mr. Uncle Sam. They renamed my friend Christopher to CJ because Christopher is a white man named like Topher Toby Maguire. We the real Hebrews. I don't know what you're saying. It's not about American history, so I'm going to move on. What would happen if World War I happened in the 1840s? Well, World War I happened in the 1750s. The 7 Years' War, which was fought in the United States and is part of American history, was indeed the First World War. And it was what set up the British taxing the Americans, which eventually led to the American independence movement, eventually leading to the Declaration of Independence being approved by the Continental Congress after being signed on July 2nd. It was finished on June 28th, and on July 4th it was approved of, and that is where the American system really began, and that is where the American independence was declared. George Washington, George III, who didn't know about what would happen for months, because that's how news traveled back then, wrote in his diary that day, nothing significant happened. Interesting enough. So, World War I, if you're referring to the Great War, would be the war between the Imperial Germans, the French, the British, and the Russians, with the United States, the Austro-Hungarians, the Turks, the Italians, the Greeks, and a bunch of other people joining later. It would have been very interesting to see it happen in the 1840s because Germany and Italy weren't countries yet. They weren't established countries. Germany was not the threat of the empire that it became, so it seems kind of impossible for it to happen. And that was a freebie. That's not an American history question, but I allowed it only because it touched on the United States ever so slightly, because I Want You for U.S. Army became a poster during that great war to end all wars. Today's Calvin Coolidge's birthday. Yes, the only U.S. president born on the 4th of July is Calvin Coolidge. And also today, my friends, we remember mournfully, I can't take my hat off quite yet, it's very, very tight, but we remember the 3 U.S. presidents who died on July 4th, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1826, 50 years after they signed the Declaration of Independence. Exactly, both of them being writers of it is pretty significant. Of course, Jefferson, the primary author, along with Franklin and Robert Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman. And Friendly History has a video coming out today at 8 p.m. Eastern in which he reads the Declaration of Independence, so please check that out. But 5 years after that, in 1831, James Monroe also died on July 4th. 3 American presidents, 3 founding fathers, all died on July 4th. Pretty spooky stuff. And yes, Calvin Coolidge was born July 4th, 1870, I believe. Or 72. So it is his birthday. Happy birthday to America's 30th president, and one of the better ones who's kind of underrated. And if you want to learn more about U.S. presidents, check out my tier ranking video on them, and my moderator will hopefully put it in the chat. You can also check out my short series on U.S. history, particularly U.S. presidents, and I'm doing a temporary short series on different moments in American history that I've done since last week, all through this weekend. And join us tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern when I will be live streaming and doing a lecture on the Declaration of Independence and the American founding. So please join us for that. That's tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern as we continue the celebrations of the 4th of July and America's semi-quincentennial, its 250th birthday. No, they did not want a Christian society. That is not true. They did not want a Christian society determined by one particular denomination, because the society was already Christian. The founding fathers believed that the Judeo-Christian ethic and morality was the most practical and best fitting for the American people, and that is the one they established. Did George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin hang out together, and what were they doing? Oftentimes trying to form the United States and create a new nation in order to create a more perfect nation, as the Constitution says. Calvin Coolidge didn't do much as president. By sitting back, he let America run during the height of the Roaring Twenties, when America's economy was extraordinarily prosperous and there was a lot of really good things going on. Americans were richer, wealthier, and more independent than ever before, and Calvin Coolidge kind of let them do their own thing. This would lead to problems, even during his own presidency, but his presidency was generally seen as a success with an extremely good economy. In fact, he's probably the first U.S. president to be judged almost completely on the basis of the economy. And if I haven't answered your question, I apologize. I hope to do my best to get there and answer as soon as possible, but I hope you are liking and subscribing. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. That is true. Give me 1 second, please. Excuse me. Okay, we are back. Is there a connection between NASCAR and the illegal trafficking of moonshine? It seems like the people who drive in NASCAR when they get in crashes might be on moonshine, but I have no idea. And Jason is a member, that's why he's got the emoji, so consider a membership, consider a super chat. A donation would help. We're doing what we can to improve the quality of a channel, and that's what we use the money for. Should African Americans celebrate when in 1776 they were slaves? That is a fantastic question, and I think the answer is yes. Although not all African Americans were slaves at the time of America's founding. Many African Americans in the North actually fought in the American Army in both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War later on. The reason the Civil War is called the Second American Revolution is because the ideas and principles of the American Revolution that had been denied so long to such a large portion of the American populace, in this case African Americans, were finally being realized, although they would not be fully completed and actualized until the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, and many believe today are still being denied in some way, shape, or form. But it's a very, very good question. Yes, in a way I believe that everyone in America should celebrate America as a country and everything that it stands for and has done for them. It is usually considered to be the freest, wealthiest, and most successful nation in the history of the world, and as Uncle Sam, I can attest to that. At the same time, of course, African Americans, the vast majority of them, their ancestors were enslaved at that time in the United States. However, the United States lived up to its principles of liberty and justice for all. It lived up to its principles of all men being created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that is why the American Revolution happened. And that is why the Civil War happened. And that is why Lincoln, in the spirit of those same founding fathers, on July 4, 1776, freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863. That is why the American government throughout the 1860s and 70s and again in the 1950s and 60s worked its tail off to provide equal rights for African Americans because they had been denied it for so long. So yes, the principles and ideals of the American Revolution, while not seen by the vast majority of African Americans, were eventually applied to them as America lived up to its onus and its responsibility and obligation in order to provide black Americans with better opportunities and freedoms. So yes, celebrating your country would be part of it, but also realizing that despite the privation that African Americans suffered, a horrible indignity as it is, that those freedoms and principles were eventually applied to them, and that there are very few places in the world today where anyone of an ethnic minority has it better off than an African American in the United States. Let me see. I believe that the 7 Years' War was World War I. We've talked about this a lot on the channel. Was Michigan involved with the Constitution? Not particularly. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 by Thomas Jefferson ended slavery in that region, prevented slavery from spreading to the Northwest Territories, and basically set up the demarcations and the acre allotments for what became the Midwestern states, such as Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. So they were part of what America got out of the end of the American Revolution. This was territory the British had won from the French at the end of the 7 Years' War. Let me see. What is considered to be the First Continental Congress? The First Continental Congress met in 1774 to 1775 and tried to sign the Olive Branch Petition to the British government in order to end the hostilities and bring down the temperature following the disasters of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and Lexington and Concord. When they eventually adjourned, and when it became obvious that nothing was going to happen, and the British were not going to stop fighting and not going to stop oppressing them with their tyranny, they reconvened. And of course, in that vein, they set up the Second Continental Congress, which did most of the heavy lifting throughout 1775 and onward. Let me see. Why do rednecks do it? Okay. Abraham Lincoln, vampire slayer. Okay, well, I'm not dressed up as Abraham Lincoln. I don't believe he was a vampire slayer, but yeah. Let me see. Let me see here. Looking through the chat. I'm trying to catch up to everything. Did African Americans have freedom and independence in 1776? Some of them did. Some of them fought in the American Revolution just for that purpose. The idea that the American founders started their war to preserve their slaves is not true, especially when the Declaration, in its first drafts, included a prohibition against slavery and a condemnation of the King of England for allowing it. It is true that America did not end slavery. In fact, it is true that the trading of slaves in Africa continued until the early 1800s. And it is true that the slave trade continued in the United States for long periods of time with horrific amounts of suffering. But it is also true that the abolitionist movement, which I mentioned earlier, was a primarily Western phenomenon that inspired the United States to fight a war in order to end their slaves and reunify the nation when the South had left so that they could preserve their ways of life and their slaves. What is the historical significance of Carnegie Hall? One of the most well-known performing centers in all of the United States, Carnegie Hall is based on Andrew Carnegie, a wealthy industrialist from Scotland. Actually, he came as a broke immigrant and eventually became one of the wealthiest men in all of human history. A robber baron, as he was known, a captain of industry. He became a steel tycoon during the times of trusts and monopolies when they controlled the British government. When they controlled the production of a particular good and were extremely influential in the American government. Carnegie, along with people like J.P. Morgan and, of course, John D. Rockefeller, were extraordinarily greedy, extraordinarily exploitative in many instances, but also extraordinarily beneficent and generous. Carnegie's donations, believing that reading was essential, he gave away millions of his own fortune to ensure that libraries and schools were established throughout the United States so that reading could set people free, like it had given him the ideas to become the rich businessman that he had become. Because of his donations and his endowments, Carnegie Hall is named after him. Many of the universities in the United States are named after captains of industry, such as Duke and Vanderbilt, and so on. Many of the research and scientific breakthroughs in pharmacy and chemistry have been because of John D. Rockefeller's exploits, and so on. Many of the captains of industry, despite their own moral questionable business practices, especially in the treatment of their workers during the Industrial Revolution, were actually formidably generous. Napoleon said history is a lie agreed upon. Well, that doesn't make much sense because Napoleon is one of the most important figures in history, and there is no lie that is agreed upon. There is plenty of truth to history. It is the debates about history in which we tend to disagree, which is completely false because Bank of America, England, run by Rothschilds, which America was still paying taxes to England, as England was still post office master of the U.S. Fed Bank still. Okay, then. Thank you, Nathan, for that incorrect view of history. First Lady Dolly Madison. People are actually asking history questions about the U.S., and I'm impressed. We're not going too off the rails, so we really appreciate that. So please double tap the screen, like the live, and subscribe for more. And we've got another hour and a half to go for answering all of your questions, and we'll see how hot it gets in this get-up today. Dolly Madison was the wife of James Madison, and while she was 17 years younger, she was 17 times more vivacious than him. She was tall, she was good-looking, she was buxom, she was a wonderful entertainer. She loved to host parties at the White House. She saved the portrait of George Washington with the help of a White House slave. Yes, the White House had slaves during the War of 1812 when the British were about to burn the U.S. Capitol, which they did. But yes, her husband was demure, quiet, and intellectual. She was feisty, spirited, and talkative. Let me see here. Hopefully I've answered your questions. Okay, first, I never asked you a question before. I asked friendly neighborhood history. Second, my question was about history, and before asking you, I asked for permission. You gave me, but let me think of questions. What is your opinion about John Brown? I've already answered the John Brown question. Let me see. I'll celebrate America when the files are released fully and Diddy isn't released early. Yes, there are many injustices in American history. There are many problems in American history, and there are many sins in America's past and present, and most likely, by the way, will be in the future. Nirvana and perfection are not for any human society in this world. Utopias do not exist, and any utopia that tries to exist soon devolves into dystopia. The truth of the matter is there are many problems with the United States, and they need to be owned up to and improved upon. That doesn't mean that this society is inferior to any other, nor that its history is not compelling nor fascinating, nor that the ideals stipulated in this document and in the Declaration signed 250 years ago today, which is why this is America's birthday, its semi-quincentennial birthday, halfway to 500 years of a Declaration of Independence, those ideals, those principles are still being chased, aspired to by America, by its leaders at times, and at times not, and by its people every single day. What president was assassinated? He was unalived by a guy from Seney, Michigan. There were 4 presidents who were assassinated. Lincoln, obviously, killed by John Wilkes Booth. I believe that would be Garfield, who was killed by Charles Guiteau. And then you have William McKinley, who was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, which allowed, of course, Theodore Roosevelt to become the president of the United States. And then you also have John F. Kennedy, assassinated supposedly by Lee Harvey Oswald. Why did we start using fireworks to celebrate the United States? Fireworks were a popular form of celebration in the 18th century all throughout Europe, and John Adams wrote and said that the celebration should include cannon fire and fireworks and festivities, which of course became backyard barbecues, parades, and picnics. In your opinion, what's the most impactful exported product in American history? What does America export more than any? Well, war would be one of the cynical options, I suppose you could say. America exports many different things. Many glorious things come from the United States. The United States has exported huge amounts of cotton. Of course, that goes back to the slave times. Corn has been exported. I think it'd be food products. The United States has exported large amounts of food, such as corn, tobacco, things like that, have been sent from the United States to other parts of the world all the time. I would say probably wheat and grain. There's a lot of that too. And oil nowadays. Why we say 4th of July? We never say December 25th. Because it's easier to say Happy 4th than it is to say Happy Independence Day. People like to mark it as a date. They like to say America is the only nation with a birthday, and that's not true. But there are many countries that have had birthdays since then that are inspired directly by America's Declaration of Independence, such as Haiti or Vietnam. Tell us about Thomas Edison, please. An American inventor, the Wizard of Menlo Park, created an entire factory of inventors and producers and took the credit for most of them. And, of course, designed things such as the incandescent light bulb, the phonograph, which became the record player, and, of course, also the moving picture system. Tell us about the story of Fort McHenry. Was there any way the British could have taken it? Yes, it was a surprise that they didn't take it, and Francis Scott Key, on a British prisoner ship from across the way, an American lawyer, saw it unfold and wrote the defense of Fort McHenry, which became the Star-Spangled Banner. And the Star-Spangled Banner is indeed the 50-pound flag that hung over the fort and today hangs in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Let me see. Why is Alexander Hamilton considered the father of our economy, and why did Aaron Burr have to go and shoot him? Great question. Very good American history. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of Treasury, and he proposed that a national bank system be created in which the United States government took on the debts of the various states, standardized the currency, and then used that debt and then borrowed against that debt in order to invest in its economy, particularly the shipping and mercantile interests of New England, where he was from himself. This was the basic cornerstone of the economic policy of the Federalist Party, opposed heavily by Jefferson and Madison, but approved of by President George Washington. Hamilton was a leader in the Federalist Party even after leaving. He helped influence the 1800 election to have the Federalists pick Thomas Jefferson against Aaron Burr in a statistical tie in the Electoral College, and then Burr, never forgiving Hamilton for this, insulted him. Hamilton struck back, and they eventually challenged one another. I believe it was Burr who challenged Hamilton to a duel where he shot and killed him in 1804. Hamilton became a legend for all of his contributions to the creation of the American experiment, from the Federalist Papers to the Constitution, to, of course, the creation of the national banking system as the first Secretary of Treasury, and Burr became an absolute pariah, considered a traitor to the United States. I do need some water. It would be nice to have a little bit of a water break real fast. I hope you'll forgive me if we do that. The first slave owner in America was black. That isn't necessarily true, but yes, there were thousands of blacks who owned slaves in the United States, including William Allison, who gave tons of money to the Confederate government. 250 years of buying life on a daily basis. Believe me, there's almost no society in the world that exists to this day that has never required people to pay to exist. Every society has required its citizenry of one form or another, even through forced labor and slavery, to pay to exist. Nobody gets in or gets out for free. That's why people pay thousands of dollars to bury someone. Who is your top 5 favorite and least favorite American presidents? Ooh, a very good question. Thank you so much. The least favorite American presidents would be James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Jimmy Carter. Let me see, who else? Ooh, as I pluck my beard. Favorite and best and worst are not the same thing. But I am picking some of the worst. Franklin Pierce. Who else do I not like? Who else do I not like? Herbert Hoover. There you go. Those are some of the worst and least favorite American presidents of mine. Nothing against them personally, but definitely should never have been president. Best and favorite are not the same, but my favorites, obviously, Lincoln and Washington come up to mind. Theodore Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. Who else? Let me see here. Ooh, John F. Kennedy. There you go. A very great president, John F. Kennedy. Would have been amazing to see what he could have done if he had lived. It was very much a tragedy that affected this nation for decades because of his death. So thank you. Good question. And happy birthday to the United States. It's 250 years. The tyrant Lincoln, not in my border states. Yes, Lincoln actually suspended John C. Fremont, the American trailblazing legend and hero and first Republican ever nominated for president in 1856, because he issued an Emancipation Proclamation for the border state of Missouri. Border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, as well as the state of West Virginia, which was created during the Civil War because it broke away from Virginia because it didn't want to leave the Union, but it still wanted to keep its slaves. Had slaves, but they had stayed with the Union. Lincoln, they are considered the neutral states. A lot of battles were fought in them, in Kentucky and in Maryland, for instance. Lincoln worried that these states would eventually join the Confederacy if he freed the slaves in them, did not apply the Emancipation Proclamation to these states, and it took until the 13th Amendment for the slaves in those regions to actually be freed. But John C. Fremont issuing an Emancipation Proclamation in Missouri infuriated Lincoln. Let me see. How did Pope Pius the Oh, I'm sorry, I lost your message. How did Pope Pius XII's actions during World War II and the early Cold War indirectly influence American foreign policy and public opinion? Obviously, you have a large number of Roman Catholics in the United States who would soon elect the first Catholic president shortly after Pius's death, I think in 1958. And because of that, they're going to listen to the Pope and have a lot of affinity for what he says, as they do to this day with Pope Leo. But the truth of the matter is that the Bishop of Rome, the vicar, whatever you want to call him, was extraordinarily condemning of communism and kind of set the Catholic motif for being anti-communism. And of course, this helped influence the Americans to continue to support overthrowing communism. It was also important during the revolution in Hungary, with Hungary being a majority Catholic country and Poland also being a majority Catholic country, for the Catholics there to realize the Vatican's condemnation of their political system during the Cold War. So it obviously helped influence the Americans. They saw it as an advocacy and an allyship. Let me see. African Americans, please don't use politically correct pseudo-terms. Well, somebody asked me about it using African American, and so I obliged respectfully. Yes, they are black Americans. We don't usually refer to white Americans as Caucasian Americans, and we call African Americans despite the vast majority of them not knowing where in Africa they come from. That is a very fair point. However, and most of them would probably refer to themselves as black instead of African American. That trend, I've noticed, has died off. But it is okay when you are trying to be eloquent, when you are trying to be rhetorical, to not just repeat yourself. Black, 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 white, white, white. Sometimes it's nice to use Caucasian or African American. Well, I would like to say that some of your answers are political and not just historical. Well, I'm answering things as historically as I possibly can. I would defy you to tell me how I'm being political. How did America live up to its ideals while maintaining slavery and subsequently creating Jim Crow, not to mention an even worse treatment of our indigenous communities? Well, Kathleen, that's a very, very good question. What must be understood is that the ideals of the United States are liberty and justice for all. It is the idea that everyone, all men, are created equal. That doesn't apply necessarily right away to every single man. In fact, it didn't even apply to every single white man. The vast majority of people that we consider white in this country today, such as the Irish, the Italians, Germans, and Greeks, were all treated as if they were second-class citizens and heavily discriminated by the native Angloid population throughout their time immigrating to the United States, as well as Jews, who are also considered to be white Americans today. The white Americans also, males, could not all vote. That took a long time for all white males to vote. That was a legacy of Jacksonian democracy, giving universal suffrage to white men. Only white men with certain amounts of property and age attainment in their late mid-30s and then mid-20s were able to vote in U.S. elections early on. So the ideals and principles were applied over time to larger and larger groups of people who suffered and struggled and were discriminated against very heavily. I noticed that you did not mention the heavy and horrific discrimination and mistreatment of the immigrant communities who were considered not white, but now are considered to be Caucasian American. Of course, the Native Americans were definitely mistreated, abused, and oppressed in American history in a horrible, horrible way. Watch my video about the Battle of the Little Bighorn where I discuss it. I'm going to have to plug in my cellular device in order to keep it charging, so the microphone will go, so the audio quality might dip for a little bit, but I hope you're enjoying this, and if you are, please like and subscribe. So Kathleen, to continue answering your question, yes, the Native Americans were treated awfully by the U.S. government. That does not, there is no justification for the horrors that the Americans inflicted upon the Native Americans. But I will say two things. One, the vast majority of Native Americans did not die from a genocide inflicted upon them by the U.S. The Native Americans mainly died off from diseases brought to them unintentionally, usually, by the Europeans. At the same time, the Native Americans also warred with each other, warred with the Europeans, used and manipulated the Europeans, and used and manipulated each other for long periods of time, and even fought wars, enslaved and colonized one another, long before the Europeans showed up. The difference with the United States was the United States was successful in conquering all native lands and doing to the natives what they had done to each other on a much massive scale because they had the technological apparatuses to do so because of the Industrial Revolution. So it is an awful thing that the United States did in many of its treatments and mistreatments and lies and broken promises to the Native Americans. And of course, maintaining slavery is a blight upon the United States. But that does not mean that America did not eventually, as time came about, see the error of their ways and try desperately to live up to its principles, apologize for its mistakes, and improve upon it. So I hope that answers your question. Why did the Brits allow the Confederate blockade breakers CSS Alabama to port and replenish in their harbors? The British were very sympathetic to the Confederates because they believed they were breaking away from the United States. They didn't understand the underpinning issue of slavery. They also, for the most part, benefited from the textile industry of the Southern plantation system and cotton. So they were very sympathetic, almost went to war with Lincoln when he kidnapped several of the ambassadors from the Confederates in the Trent Affair. But yes, eventually, after the Emancipation Proclamation, both Britain and France threw up their arms and said they could not support the Confederacy because the war was now about slavery. Good question, Tony, and some great questions in the chat. Are Lewis and Clark important, or is their importance overrated? Well, it may seem like it is overrated. The 19th century is the century of American exploration, and they are the ones who got that started, working with Sacagawea and the Shoshone Indians in order to properly plot out the Missouri River and take it all the way till its end, eventually landing in the Northwest Territories of Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. So yes, they are extremely important because really, after them, you've got people like Davy Crockett. You later have John C. Fremont and Kit Carson and all these amazing American trailblazers and the pioneers of the Oregon Trails and things like this. They are inspired and are able to chart the path and follow in the footsteps, sometimes even literally, of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Uncle Sam, the draft. Uncle Sam has nothing to do with Independence Day. Uncle Sam has everything to do with all things American. Almost got a part in Glory as an extra in Savannah, Georgia, or Comfort wouldn't let us. Had to go to war. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I enjoy personal tidbits about history. Why did it barbecues, hamburgers, hot dogs, and such become a key aspect of America and is often the stereotype for people who look in from the inside? Well, they are overly American foods. They are easy to make, they are delicious, they are fatty, and they are enjoyable, and Americans love their fatty food. But they are also a testament to the strong history of immigration in the United States. The hot dogs are inspired by bratwurst, which are German. Hamburgers are named after Hamburg in Germany. Barbecues, well, that's more American than anything else. But things like that are a testament to the influence of immigration. And think of other foods Americans love, like pizza or Chinese food or tacos. All of those are a testament to the large immigration populations that have helped shape the American culture, especially over the last century and a half. How much money is enough? A little more. Yes, I love that answer. It's such a fun answer from a man who exploited so many to get his wealth. Mercy of Elizabeth of Russia. We're not talking about other types of history, but I have plenty of history on the Russian czars. Is there an Aunt Samantha, and what happened to the goddess Erica, known as Columbia? I don't know. I'm not sure what your question entails. The Vice President, Thomas Marshall, asked when Theodore died, Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. Yes, I love that. Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt, one of the greatest American presidents, and probably my personal favorite, besides Lincoln and Washington, dies in his sleep in 1919 of a heart attack at the age of 60. Some say from a broken heart because his youngest son, Quinton, had died fighting in the American Army during the Great War, which, of course, you know me from. But Also, important to point out, Thomas Marshall is an interesting figure. He was Woodrow Wilson's vice president and was heavily inactive during Wilson's stroke controversy, never assuming the office of the presidency. The 25th Amendment of the 1960s eventually clarified what that meant. It meant that the vice president needed to assume the duties of the president if there was ever a moment where the president was incapacitated. It was actually his wife Edith Wilson. Alice was Theodore Roosevelt's wife, who assumed most of the duties of the presidency while her husband suffered from his stroke, a debilitation which he would never recover from and would die only a few years after leaving office. But Marshall didn't step up and kind of let it be what it was. And it's a very interesting story that a lot of people don't know about. But Thomas Marshall was the vice president for Woodrow Wilson, and I do love that quote. So thank you for sharing that, whoever was that who shared it. Oh, yes, Sting the Fox Boy. What did the immediate actions at 9/11 Ground Zero in New York, like making and makeshift crosses, hanging the American flag, and major assistance, show about the patriotism back then? It showed that Americans were very united and very, very quick to join in prayer and consultation and sympathy and support and solidarity after the horrific actions of a war on terror. No matter the mistakes and the overreactions made afterwards, the truth of the matter is it was an extraordinarily successful effort by the Americans to rally into their patriotic fervor following the events of those tragic days. All religions are mythology. Please check out A Quest for Knowledge. Okay, thank you for that suggestion. This is a History Channel. Handy Andy, thank you for the Canadian dollar donation. Again, all donations to the channel are used to improve the quality of the channel. All memberships do the same. Members get early access. They get extra videos, and they get all sorts of things. And I want you to become a friendly neighborhood historian by liking and subscribing. And I want you to become an official friendly neighborhood historian by becoming a member. There are different tier rankings, and you can have your own emojis and all sorts of incredible things. Now that the promo is over, let's get back to the Super Chat. I respond in more detail always to Super Chats because they are very, very generous. And whether or not Canada becomes part of the United States in the future is none of my business. I appreciate the sympathy from our Angloid neighbors to the north. Happy birthday, America. My grandparents were from upstate New York but moved to Canada as United Empire loyalists. I feel ripped off my opportunity to live in the greatest country. Love the channel. Well, you could always become a dual citizen. And you are not, sounds like you're not far away from the United States. And the United States has had a friendly and good relationship with Canada for a long time. And even if that might be changing right now, look back over the last 160 years since Canada achieved self-government on July 1st, their Independence Day in 1867, and see the close relationships between the United States, the British Empire, and the Canadians. Let me see. What happened to Columbia, the goddess of America? Well, she was... what do you mean, what happened to her? Again, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by the question. The Americans don't worship her, but they see her as the symbol. She is the goddess who holds the light. That's why Columbia Picture Studios has the woman holding the torch and is seen as a representation, a female personification of America. In many ways, she would be the lady I would be taking out to dance if we were thinking of mascots. There's the male mascot, and there's the female mascot. So she, in some ways, is my counterpart. But she isn't necessarily the goddess of the Americans. She is just referred to, obviously, because of Columbus's name and the Americans thinking of naming their country Columbia. That was Ben Franklin, who I mentioned earlier. And, of course, the capital is named the District of Columbia. A very lovely lady indeed, but not a goddess, just like I am not a god. Did the colonists owe the British Empire millions of dollars, which is why they started the war? Did they ever pay the British Empire back? No. You could say they paid them back by liberating them from 2 world wars in the 20th century. Nobody likes hearing that, but it's kind of true. They did owe them money in the sense of they didn't necessarily owe them money, but the British had protected the American colonies during the 7 Years' War. But American colonials had suffered and died with the British and their Indian allies against the French and their native allies during the conflict known as the French-Indian War, which was a leg of the much larger 7 Years' War fought internationally, which this channel humbly believes is the first real world war. So did they owe them? Not necessarily. But did they owe them for their protection? Yes. Did that cost the British millions? Yes. Were the taxes overwhelmingly heavy? No. That is a misconception and a historical myth. So let me bust that myth for you. The Americans did not have a revolution because the British were taxing them, nor did they have it because the British were taxing them too much. The taxes were minuscule compared to the taxes in Britain and in India. But the truth of the matter was that the taxation that the British did was without the representation and the express written consent of the American people. Yes, the Americans operated like the NFL. So they basically said, well, we don't have the ability to determine our own fate. We don't have the ability to vote or have a say in Parliament about these taxes. So this is taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. The idea that the Americans revolted over taxes is partially true. but it was about the lack of proper representation in the British government and the lack of proper voicing of political rights and freedoms. That and what they saw as not only the unwillingness of the British to allow them to properly participate in their governmental system and process, but the problem was that soon they found that the British became more and more tyrannical by quartering soldiers, closing their ports, and all the other grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence, which you can hear Friendly Neighborhood History read at 7 p.m. Eastern today when he's back. So, please check that out. And also check out some American memes. If you like hilarity and you enjoy a good chuckle now and then, please check that video out from yesterday. It's Friendly Neighborhood History, looking at American history through the lens of humor. So, anyways, yes, Hamilton was a real guy, and I am not an American wizard, but I am a wizard at history. I am a whiz at history, you could say. I'm sorry, I'll stop. It is not a Klanhood. I disavow and hate and despise the Ku Klux Klan and all of their racist history. Yep. It's a very common poster in an American history class to have Uncle Sam. So, by the way, another part of the American Revolution. The colonists probably would have paid the taxes had they had representation in the British government, and probably would have stayed with the British if they felt the British were not being oppressive by slowly but surely coercing them, such as the Intolerable Acts, into paying the taxes, allowing soldiers to stay in their cities, and closing down their ports. That is why the Americans rebelled, not because of the British, because of taxes being too heavy. Let me see. Did the colonists, I already answered that? What was the name of the English guy who brought the Industrial Revolution from England to the U.S.? Mr. Samuel Slater took the textile industries of southern England and brought them to New England in the north. Lowell, Massachusetts was the first place that he really got started with the factory system in the 1810s after the War of 1812, which I was a part of. You might want to know that story. I was helping the United States gather as much meat as possible to feed their soldiers in their conflict against the scurvy British, who would be impressing their sailors and stealing their cargo. Was the American War of Independence a British Civil War? That's a very good question. There's possibly some truth to it. But it's not considered a civil war normally when a colony rebels against its overlords. That's considered a revolution. The Haitian Revolution is not a civil war. They're different people with different cultures. For the longest time, the British had taxed the Americans indirectly before the Revolution. The Americans would collect taxes from their local governments, such as the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and some of those taxes would be paid to operate the government of the state of the colony of Virginia, but some would be given to the established church, which is why the First Amendment defies the establishment of a national church or national. The Establishment Clause rebukes the idea of any particular religion or denomination of Christianity in their context being set up as the national religion of the country. But at the same time, the Americans were used to that. They were okay with taxes going to the British. They had never been taxed directly by the British before, and they weren't being taxed with representation, and that is what angered them. Hubert Hoover made the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem, probably to drum up sympathies for a suffering America in 1931. Let me see here. Why is the Federal Reserve not federal? And if it's not federal, who are the major shareholders and people make decisions? The Federal Reserve is a private bank that operates the federal currency. That is why it's called the Federal Reserve. Originally composed of and thought of on Jekyll Island, it was basically a more permanent, powerful form of the national bank system from the 19th century, reimagined as a private bank that operated the American monetary supply as well as interest rates, and was brought into existence with Woodrow Wilson's 1914 Federal Reserve Act. Let me see here. When did the mass production and bottling of water and drinks happen in terms of plastic water bottles? Sometime in the 20th century. Don't know exactly when. I mean, they also bottled milk and put it in glass bottles and delivered it everywhere. Let me see here. I don't know why these comments about stolen land are being deleted. That's actually a good question. The truth of the matter is, as difficult as it is, the land in America has been stolen if you believe that conquest of lands, such as California and the Southwest in the Mexican-American War, or Indian Territory conquered in wars with the Indians, or the 13 colonies itself conquered in a revolution against the British, along with the Midwest, as I mentioned earlier. If you truly believe that those lands are indeed, and thank you again, Andy, for the super chat, we really appreciate you. If you believe that those lands are stolen, then you believe that all land conquered in all wars is stolen, which means that almost all land in history has been stolen from one hand to another because empires have come and gone. So yes, American land is stolen, But that means that all land, conquered or otherwise, is stolen. No one just showed up to bear land and just took it. It's very rare for that to happen. Let me see here. I don't know, LBJ and Lincoln, JFK. There are some similarities. Lincoln and John Kennedy were great presidents about a century apart. Both had vice presidents named Johnson. And both were obviously tragically assassinated. Why your favorite president is the same as Friendly History? Well, Friendly History and I agree on a lot. Let me see. Conquered land, not stolen. Yes, the land indeed was conquered. It was not necessarily stolen, although treaties and breaking of treaties by the United States did lead to what many have considered the theft of these lands. But most of them were not taken without a fight. In fact, the United States not only conquered lands, some of the lands they conquered they actually paid for, which is extraordinarily uncommon. Not only did the United States pay for the southwestern California after conquering it in the Mexican-American War, it paid for the remainder of the territory of Arizona and New Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase a few years later. The only good thing, I would say, of Franklin Pierce's administration. The American dream. That's funny when Trump sleeps. That's very, very funny. Did J. Edgar Hoover blackmail Kennedy? Possibly. He blackmailed a lot of people. 250 years of world's biggest genocide and land theft. Except that's not true. The largest genocides in human history occurred during the 20th century in the Soviet Union, China, and of course the Holocaust. The United States did not genocide the Native Americans. They did destroy many of the tribe's ways of lives. They killed off many of them through war. The vast majority of them died through disease, an unintentional consequence of cultural exchange. A very sad and tragic thing. And I have not sought to justify any of the actions of the United States regarding the Native Americans. But nor will I justify the idea that the United States targeted for the systematic execution and destruction of every single Native American in a genocidal way. Now, there were people with genocidal tendencies and obviously no love for the Native American, which was absolutely horrific, and terrible results came about because of it. However, to call it a genocide is an exaggeration and a misrepresentation of what actually happened. At the same time, land theft is not the same as land conquest and settlement. The concepts and conceptions and understandings of how land operated between both the United States and the Native American tribes and nations was completely different. Miscommunications were bound to happen. Miscommunications that were sometimes created and manipulated by the Americans, no doubt about it. There is a lot of tragedy and horror in what the United States did to the Native Americans. But to say that the Native Americans would not have done likewise or had not done likewise is to misrepresent them completely. And to show a bias that is extraordinarily unfair, David. Who was the first foreign leader who traveled to the United States? Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. It might have been, I think it was a British prime minister. If Kennedy's back surgery didn't fail, he could have ducked after being hit with the first bullet. I don't think so. When the first bullet did the damage to him. My house here in Sweden is older than your nation. That's kind of fun. Oh, so the person who isn't... Okay. The person who complained about American genocide and things comes from a nation of Sweden, which is a country known for the Vikings. Kind of ironic, but okay. And of course, the Vikings weren't all that awful either. But that's what historical context shows us. People are far more complex than we originally give them credit for, whether they be Vikings, Native Americans, or the United States itself. And who was the first monarch of any country who traveled to the U.S. after U.S. independence? I'm not sure. Again, not sure. It might have been Napoleon III of France. It might have been Victoria. I don't think Victoria ever made it to the States. Might have been Edward VII. I'm not sure. I'm not going to misrepresent something if I don't know. Why did Washington not want to be a monarch? He did not get rid of George III to become George I. He believed that he idolized Cincinnatus and the Roman Republic and the ideals of freedom and representative government. He had fought for liberty and for the creation of a republic. He wasn't about to supersede that republic and become a monarch, even a constitutional one. He believed that monarchs tended toward tyranny, and he didn't want to be one. Idolizing the Roman Republic, he loved Cincinnatus, the great general who just wanted to hang out on his farm and intervene only when necessary to protect his beloved Roman homeland. Truman and Dewey election. Can you please give your opinion on that? Well, Truman was supposed to be defeated by Thomas E. Dewey. The prediction was that Truman, who had very low approval ratings, would be defeated. But his square deal, his anti-communism, and the successfulness of ending the last World War, and the success of ending the last World War, was enough to carry him over the finish line in actually a pretty convincing fashion against the New York governor and popular Republican candidate. Of course, it's best known for Truman holding up the Chicago Daily News saying Dewey defeats Truman when he obviously won, with a big beaming smile on his face. Would JFK have escalated Vietnam had he not been assassinated? No. He was staunchly against that. Had okay, let me see. 50 million natives genocide by your filth is what you called conquered. Except that they were defeated and conquered, and the vast majority of the ones you mentioned who died, as tragic as it is, died because of disease. All right, try not to burn down the White House. Let me see. There are indigenous black Americans referred to as the freedmen. Yes, those were men who were freed, obviously, who were never slaves, or who were able to buy their freedom in one way or another. Okay. Let me see, what else? Not every democracy, when you give it enough time, evolves and fixes its social problems over time. That is the pattern in every democracy. True. I see it as concentric circles. Over time, more freedoms, rights, and opportunities were given to more and more people as America was held accountable for its values. The ideals that it supposedly lived on, it did not always own up to, and so it was held to do so by different civil rights movements, especially during the 20th century. What's the difference between Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton? One was a better actor. Very funny. Why did Ronald Reagan go into politics? He believed the Republican Party had become too moderate and too weak, and he wanted a more conservative vision for America. He believed America was losing in many factors, especially with the Cold War. Over 100 million people dead of my people. Yes, it was awful what happened to the Native Americans. It truly was. Why is that the only thing that matters to you, though? Why is that the only thing that you focus upon? The United States is not directly responsible for all of those deaths, not even the majority of them. And that's an exaggeration. Are there more Democrats or Republicans? Today, there are more Democrats than Republicans, though the Republicans are gaining on them. Could Henry Clay in voter tallies and registrations? Could Henry Clay have been a great U.S. president? What kept him from being elected? Yes, he probably could have been a pretty good American president. But what kept him from being elected was Andrew Jackson in 1824, and keeping him out of the top three so that he could use his influence in the House of Representatives to get him elected because he was the Speaker of the House. And then, obviously, in 1832, he loses to Jackson again, and in 1840, he loses to William Henry Harrison. Basically, Clay tried over and over again, was popular, was likable, but the Jacksonian Democrats were dominant at different periods and different times. 1836, sorry, or 1844. Jacksonian democracy, expansionism, those were popular strategies. Clay was a compromise candidate, a moderate who, although being from a slave state and I believe owning slaves, was not willing for slavery to travel into the Western territories. So he, as a moderate, really didn't get a lot of love. And showed that in compromise, someone has to lose. And in that case, it was Henry Clay. But a great politician, the great compromiser, an incredible mind, and a brilliant politician. Is it true that there was a failed coup in Washington during FDR? Yes. The Nazis, I believe, wanted him couped. God bless America, God bless the Union. Yes, there's a lot to love about America, and there's a lot to hate, and there's a lot to complain about, and there's a lot to celebrate. And we should be able to do both. We should not be only doing one or the other. There are many, many problems with America that need to be recognized, and there are many, many successes of America that need to be accentuated. Hindsight is plain, yes. Why are we banning everyone? Oh, I see why we're banning them. I'm reading what they're actually saying, and it's pretty crazy. Why did Paul get banned? Okay. I'm sorry if I haven't answered your question. It's probably because something you said got banned. What do you think about Trump? How would Teddy Roosevelt react if he knew that he was president now? Andrew Jackson considered himself to be the successor of Jeffersonian democracy. Thomas Jefferson believed Andrew Jackson to be a dangerous man. I believe that there would be a similar idea between Trump and Roosevelt. Trump would see himself as the continuation of the progressive populism and nationalism of the Theodore Roosevelt years, and I think Roosevelt would be very leery of Trump's aggressiveness. What is your stance on MLK? Absolutely great man, changed American history for the better, and applied the standards in that Declaration of Independence to African Americans and forced the American government to do so as well. Let me see. So USA are religious nation, nut jobs, just like ISIS and Taliban. Yes, well, except that the United States does not actively try to kill people because they are of a different religion. In fact, the United States is probably one of, if not the most diverse religious society in the world. It has freedom of religion, one of the first societies to ever have that, and its constitution rejected the establishment of any sort of religious system. The founders recognized that the American people were generally speaking Christian and would act like Christians and therefore the society would probably benefit from Christian values and ideals and the Judeo-Christian ethic that they at the very least respected, if not followed. That was the attitude of the founding fathers. Yes, MLK was not perfect. He was fallible. He plagiarized. He had sympathies with far-left communist agitators at a time when the FBI was seeking to destroy him because of that. At the same time, he also had multitudinous affairs with various different women. Some of them seem to be, or are argued, are less consensual than we might think. Kennedy may have even had a liaison the night before he was tragically assassinated. That does not change what he accomplished for the American people. In the same way we try to destroy figures like George Washington because he owned slaves, we should not do that because we must recognize that his accomplishments for the nation were beyond his weaknesses as a slaveholder. And likewise, we must also recognize that Martin Luther King's weaknesses as a man does not hold back the accomplishments he made for the nation, which are separate from his plagiarism or his philandering. And many people are victims of their time. Thank you, Luca. I tend to know my stuff. I happen to be Uncle Sam, after all. Harding once said, "I am never fit for this office and never should have been here." Harding was a compromise candidate with a lot of charisma who was able to toe the line of conservative economic politics and probably would have been successful had he been able to get over Teapot Dome, get reelected, which he probably would have been, and not died, or have his wife murder him, which is a possibility too. Let me see here. Or that might have been Taft who said it, but Harding seems like something he would say. He was a very passive man, but he did like power, and he liked poker, and he was pretty corrupt. Might have just enjoyed the luxuries and benefits of being president rather than actually doing the job. Although some of what he did included the first arms reduction treaty in human history, and also the the economic reform that was necessary at the end of deregulating the military economy left over from the Great War. Canada has to take a second seat because Puerto Rico will be the 51st state. That is most likely the case, but I don't expect Canada to become part of the United States. Did Nixon carpet bomb North Vietnam and Cambodia as well as Laos? Yes. In order to destroy what he called the Viet Minh Trail, he wanted to destroy all of the supply lines and all of the resources that the Viet Cong would get from North Vietnam and their communist allies in order to basically make it impossible for the Viet Cong to continue to undermine the South Vietnamese military and government. Remember, the South Vietnamese Viet Cong were not North Vietnamese invaders. They were aided by the North Vietnamese, but they were South Vietnamese fighting to free their country from the imperialism and the westernism of America and the dictators that South Vietnam suffered under during the 1950s and 60s. They were communists aided by the North, and Nixon sought to end the war, which he did, and also to bring about their destruction so that South Vietnam could continue. He did not succeed at this. How many Democrats does it take to screw in a light bulb? Okay, I don't really want to do the political stuff. This is a history channel. Let's focus on the history. Yes, the lobster back. That is the nickname, the pejorative nickname given to British soldiers, regulars called redcoats during the American Revolution, because obviously they wore red coats, and so it looked like they had lobster-colored backs. The U.S. joined the war because of Pearl Harbor. Also, Lend-Lease, heavy pressures from the British, and also the underdog fight of the Soviet Union during Barbarossa against the Germans all encouraged the Americans to join the fight. The Americans had not been silent in the fight up until Pearl Harbor. They had been clearly siding with the Allies. My ancestors found that the British were compromised and were prepared subjugation of U.S. period. Interesting. I don't know if that's true, but I go with it. With respect to religious freedom, what about religion that contracts the American Constitution? You mean contradicts the American Constitution? Well, though that has been decided by the impressive American court system, district, appellate, supreme, federal, and state and local, through the centuries. Are there religious practices that actually, in their practice of their beliefs, violate the American Constitution? We mentioned the Mormons earlier. The American government believed that the practice of polygamy violated basic human decency and morality, and therefore Utah could not become a state during that time because of that. So, what did the American government do? They insisted that the Mormons stop the practice of polygamy being sanctioned, which they did, and then Utah became a state. There has been small Mormon cults that have continued this practice that the American government has tried to shut down for other reasons as well, like child abuse and such. So there have been instances in American history where the government, despite guaranteeing the freedom of religion, suppresses certain freedoms because they believe those people are in violation of the Constitution and are morally reprehensible. So obviously, a religion that advocates and brings violence to others would be contrary to basic natural law and morality, and would obviously not be an expression of the freedom of religion. The freedom of religion was in the minds of the early Americans, the freedom to practice whichever Christian denomination you wanted without having to worry about a state establishing one where you had to pay a tax if you didn't want to be a part of it. Virginia forced its colonists, and later the people of its state before the Constitution, to pay a tax in order to not be part of the Episcopal Church or the Church of Virginia. So the First Amendment in the Establishment Clause bans the establishment by the states of a particular religion. It also bans the U.S. government from doing the same thing. So good question, Jack B.A. When did the practice of policing start? Police splitting away from the military. Runaway slaves, is what I have heard, was a way in which the police force started. Police became popular in the latter part of the 19th century as municipalities developed different neighborhoods, and there was a need for policing the criminality in these different neighborhoods, if I remember correctly, at least in the United States. It also makes sense that in industrialized societies, there's a need for a police force that is separate from the military in larger cities during urbanized movements, which was common during the Industrial Revolution. If Grant was in Ford's Theater on that day, Booth would have been able to kill Lincoln. No, and sadly, I think he would have killed both of them, which would have been horrible for America. When did the practice... Oh, I already answered that. So the reason that American Civil War is not a revolution, but a civil war is because the South states were not colonies. No, they were part of the United States. They were Americans. It was a fight between different Americans, as we talked about in the live stream the other day. Can you please explain the Articles of Confederation? Good question. So there is a middle period, a liminal point between the American Revolution and the freedoms won there, and the creation of the U.S. Constitution at the end of the 1780s. During that time, America was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which created a Congress but no president, did not have a judiciary system, and basically relied on representatives, one from each state, to basically figure out the laws for that particular state or region. So these various peoples would meet, but they weren't able to really levy taxes. They were able to levy taxes, but they could not standardize the monetary system. So there were different forms of money for different colonies. They could not create an effective military, and they could not regulate interstate trade and commerce. Because of this, there were all sorts of conflicts between different states, and regionalism was becoming an issue, wherein the states of the North were significantly different from the states of the South, so they acted in different ways with different agendas and different accomplishments. So because of that, the United States basically, more or less, the Constitution was advocated because the Articles of Confederation couldn't make effective policy. They couldn't keep America going, basically. And this is what led to the Constitutional Convention. Okay, let me see. Why did the Republican candidate deliver a speech from the pile for... Okay, thank you. Yes, we get it. Ronald Reagan jokes, whatever. How and when U.S. became so rich? When was it born from a small, relatively weak nation? The Industrial Revolution, the technological achievements of the 19th century mixed with the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of the South and the West after the American Civil War, that is when America becomes a very rich nation. Late 19th century. Don't forget, we didn't have a revolution. We had a colonial revolt just like India or Kenya or the Dutch India. Yes, it's called a revolution, James. Let me see. You can't ignore Central Asian Muslim who accepted Islam. That's why European got America. No, that has nothing to do with any of it. Why are we deleting people? What is happening? It seems like things have gone kind of crazy in the chat. Lyndon Johnson became president on a plane. Yes, he was sworn in by a local district judge with Jackie Kennedy standing next to him right after the tragic loss of her husband. I love it when people think there's an actual difference between Democrats and Republicans. It shows how stupid Americans are. Yes, I love how you think you're on a higher plane. Believe me, Americans have been complaining about the duopoly and the political system since its inception. George Washington warned against it, and this is one of the reasons why. They weren't over here in America peaceful little Indians or anything. They killed each other all the time in America and had a lot of people coming to their shores, England, France, and the lot. Yes, it is true that the Native Americans were far from peaceful, but they did have a better understanding of nature and the resources and terrain of the American land than the Americans did. Let me see. I think marrying American Christian girls should be prohibited because they support genocide. What are you even speaking to, Salim? I'm very confused with you. Most Europeans also died of diseases. The same diseases that killed the Indians also swept through Europe, killing millions. True. They had centuries to develop protections. The natives did not. Yes. I think USA and Israel, okay. I don't know why he's not being banned, but other people are. We're trying to focus on American history. So please ask a question about American history to Uncle Sam. We are 40 minutes. Oh, wait, let's see here. We've gone 80 minutes. So we've gone an hour and 20 minutes talking about U.S. history, and we've got 40 more minutes to go. And really, really hope you're enjoying this. And if you are, please double tap the screen, like and subscribe, and all of that good stuff. And check out all of the history, short, long, and live form, available from Friendly History as we celebrate America's semi-quincentennial. A happy birthday to the United States. This is Uncle Sam answering all of your questions about history and social studies. Let me see. Moving forward. Why was Paul deleted? Why was Julian timed out? This doesn't make any sense. These are friendly neighborhood historians, well-known people in the channel. Why was America unsuccessful in stopping the Bolsheviks in Russia? They never really attempted to. They tried to bring Russia back into the war. That's why they sent soldiers over there. They were obviously terrified of communism spreading to their own shores. Look at Sacco and Vanzetti, and of course the Red Scare. They didn't approve of communism, but they were war-weary, and so was the rest of Europe. It was Churchill who continued to advocate that the British and the Americans and all their other allies should continue the fight against the Soviets, even after the German war had ended. Let me see. Let me see here. Anyways. How would Andrew Jackson react to the world today? He would be furious that there were so many rights for people that he believed to be inferior. He was very, very racist and very, very sexist and very, very bigoted, even for those days. U.S. is a Christian majority country, but it is not a fundamentalist country. I don't know why some people don't get that. Well, even now, as America becomes more and more secular, it is still heavily Christian in many aspects and obviously influenced and created in many forms by Christianity. And to say that the Founding Fathers were not influenced or aware of that is to insult their intelligence and American history. And I'm not going to stand for that. There is no Judeo, that's the point. Desperate Jews came up with that. It's a Christian society and a Christendom, that's it. Except that there was heavy regard and respect given to Jews during the American Revolution, during the formation of the country. There was I forget the name of it, but there was a synagogue that Washington frequented often in his time in Philadelphia. The Founding Fathers believed that the Jewish and Christian God were the same God and had showed a lot of deference and respect to the principles of Moses and the Ten Commandments, and were both born. That's interesting. That's true. Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln were born in the History does daily videos, daily born today, died today, and today in history videos that you can check out. And thank you for the gifts, Harry. We really appreciate it. So yes, can we get that? Oh, good. And Trump Bunny. Okay, interesting name, but thank you. So yes, every assassination are done under a man who was hoping to be king in shades of revenge war. Except that's not true. Anyway, what you said about MLK, I should say that Charlie Kirk strongly disagrees with you, and he thinks MLK was a very bad person, so arguably what you said about MLK is disrespectful to Kirk. Only if you are the most short-sighted and foolish of individuals is this true. I can disagree with Charlie Kirk without disrespecting him or his legacy. Whatever you might think about him, the man certainly had a huge impact on America, and his death is a horrific tragedy. So, the truth of the matter is that MLK had moral failings. That doesn't make him a bad person, and that doesn't make what he fought for or accomplished to be an excellent good. Same thing with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and many of the other great people in history. American and otherwise. Did counterculture movement ruin America or help America? It definitely led to a liberalization of America in many ways. It helped shape and define that generation and the 1960s. It brought about the peace movement. It brought about an end of the war of Vietnam. So there were many impacts of it. I don't know help or hurt. I can't quite say one way or another. It depends on what you think of American society being shaped by the baby boomers and the legacy of the 1960s. Obviously, the death of Kennedy shocked and rocked the nation and changed so many things, including America's involvement in the Vietnam War, which directly impacted the rise of the counterculture. A Christian secular democratic republic makes sense. It is a democratic republic based on Judeo-Christian ethics. And Scavenger, you may hate the Jewish people, but that doesn't mean that they are not impactful in the creation of the American story. That doesn't change it. Just like it doesn't change that Benjamin Netanyahu is the Prime Minister of Israel, even if you despise him for perhaps understandable reasons. He still is, it's just a fact. Yes, the Viet Cong won Vietnam. That is true. Better situation remain as it is, so Hopper King, I don't even know what you're saying. How was Trump elected for a second term? That is historical, although it borders on political. I'll sum it up very quickly. The Democratic Party replaced President Joe Biden way late in the election cycle because they were worried about an absolute blowout in the Electoral College, which would hurt them in Congress. So they decided to stem the bleeding with Kamala Harris, who actually did a little bit of that, but was unsuccessful in her attempt to stop Mr. Trump from returning to the White House, especially after he survived an assassination attempt. And obviously, Americans being disenfranchised and frustrated with the Biden policies, both domestically and in foreign policy, obviously could not separate his vice president from him, so they voted for Donald Trump to come back no matter what they thought of him. They wanted one big change, just as they did 8 years prior. Let me see. Faraz, what Charlie Kirk have to do with MLK? Yeah. Very true. Why did the color blue chosen for America as contrast of red and for British? Well, the red, white, and blue of the United States, which I am wearing proudly today on America's 250th birthday, this semi-quincentennial, is because of the British flag being the Union Jack. It is a derivative of the British flag itself, which is a combination of the Scottish and English flag, which would later, and Welsh flag, which would later include the Irish flag after the Second Act of Union in the 1800s. How many Democrats does it take to screw? Okay, thank you. You keep repeating the same joke. Stop it. Make jokes about, if you're going to do that, make jokes about Republicans too. Let's keep it fair and balanced here. They should teach politics in school so that people can understand that the left and right is a Christian thing. Left and right people from Christianity. Get what I'm saying? Well, the left and the right is a derivative of the French Revolution, but of course has had an influence on American history. And in truth, there is no French Revolution without the American Revolution. The more conservative constitutional monarchists during the French Revolution, the Gridons, sat on the right side of the National Assembly, while the more progressive Jacobins, who wanted more violence and Republican virtues and no monarchy, sat on the left side. Let me see here. You don't get mad at others who ask religious questions. No, I don't get mad at others. I'm tired of the religious questions. People bring up religious things and I tell them to stop. I have said that on multiple occasions. I said I've wanted to talk about history. So you think you're being picked on, but that's not true. It's the only thing you ever seem to want to talk about, and I'm getting kind of tired of it. But I've answered everything you've asked. Yes, America both sides, that's true. The Marshall Plan, to rebuild it during the 1940s and 50s. I'm sorry, I'm behind on the questions. I'm going to catch up, Mindy, I promise. I've given a lot of detailed answers to a lot of great questions to celebrate America's 250th. I'm excited to talk about American history, and I hope you are too. Let me see here. Any man with more than 7 wives is just time warped. You mean like, well, Henry VIII was very close. I'm trying to think of an American who did that. Not every state had an established state church, but some did. And to prevent that, that's why the First Amendment has the Establishment Clause. You had the Spanish, French, and the Portuguese. Yes, the French and the Spanish helped, but not the Portuguese. The Portuguese were allies with the British and have been for a long time. Look here in South Africa, for a country had the Dutch Reformed Church as the head, and then the black. Okay, well, all right. We're trying to focus on American history here, and trying not to focus too much on religion. Is the 1960s U.S. still part of American history, or is it not a cause? It was not really patriotic. Of course it is. Every decade is part of American history, even if the decade was full of trouble and turmoil. There was no more trouble and turmoil in the 1960s than in the 1860s. You didn't have a giant civil war in the 1960s. You had a cultural war, civil war in some aspects, but American and the political divisions were really, really bad, and there were a lot of problems. But the United States managed to stay together, something that didn't happen in the 1860s. Were Black Panthers or Nation of Islam black supremacists? To some extent, yes, they were. They believed that black separatism would actually work, and Pan-Africanism. That basically African Americans were so mistreated for so long that the only way they could actually succeed and thrive was to separate themselves completely from white society and to gain their rights through their own actions, even if it meant total segregation, self-inflicted segregation against white Americans. Let me see here. Actually, George Washington specifically wanted a two-party system, homeschooler. No, George Washington believed that the political parties were a danger and a threat to the democracy and Republican virtues of the American Revolution and experiment. Let me see here. Uncle Sam, what is your favorite American act? What do you mean American act? You mean a particular law passed in American history that would be my favorite? The Homesteading Act. That is how the West got settled. All revolutions passed by Lincoln in the 1860s. All revolution is the same thing. A bunch of okay. If Ottoman Empire did not block Europe's access to Asia today, we wouldn't have US today. Partially true. It is true that the settlement of this continent and this continent to the south was a result of the Ottoman Empire continually competing and combating Europeans who sought other means to make it to India, even going west, like Christopher Columbus suggested. So we are talking about history of the United States. But during this live stream, we still have a half hour to go. We are also discussing history of how the U.S. was founded. So I am more than open to talking about the Dutch settling New Amsterdam, Christopher Columbus, or the Native Americans, if you would like. I am very, very happy to discuss it. Somebody asked about 1619 and African Americans and their history here. That is perfectly acceptable, and we appreciate it. Now, that doesn't mean I'm willing to go into long history about Latin American countries or Canada, but I am willing to talk about how the United States was formed in the context of what was going on. So for Oz's question doesn't seem like it's on topic, but it's actually a very, very good question indeed, and he should be proud of it. And you should be proud of my moderators. They do a great job. Harry and Hars, Friendly History always speaks so highly of them, and you should show them some love. Check out Harsinet's channel where he does all sorts of U.S. history, and go easy on Harry because today is a sad day for him. Despite the fact that it's his birthday, it's the loss of Britain's greatest colony. And if the British had kept on to the American colonies, they could have settled the entire sea to shining sea of the continental United States and become the greatest empire in human history without a doubt. You can be really honest with me. You can always be really honest with me. Well, that's very sweet of you, Faraz. I'm so glad that you're spending your the 250th birthday with us here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. They wanted Washington to be king. He literally advocated for a multi-party system. No, he didn't want to be king, but he didn't want faction. Faction is discussed in the Federalist Papers, which were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Of course, Jay became the first Supreme Court justice after the Supreme Court was founded in the third branch of the American government. Madison wrote most of the Constitution at Washington's behest, and Alexander Hamilton, we talked about earlier, the first Secretary of the Treasury. During the Federalist Papers, there was this issue of faction, of people working for their own political gains and own personal motivations and needs, hurting the American experiment and hurting what America was because of that experiment. These folks were warned about, and Washington believed that political parties were examples of faction. It was America that was supposed to be the United States becoming the divided states politically. And yes, happy 250th birthday to America. During the American history, has there ever been a communist America? There have been many communists in America. The Communist Party was legal multiple times, although it was heavily suppressed. People joined the Communist Party in sympathy with the Spanish Civil War and the Republican side of that, not the Republicans in America, but the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. People sympathized with communism because of the Soviet Union. Some people sympathized with communism because they wanted, they believed that they were advocating for workers and bringing about the freedom and equality of all people through workers of the world uniting. The only thing them having to lose is their chains, as Karl Marx said. So yes, there have been plenty of communist Americans. They have been suppressed mightily at different times during both Red Scares, particularly in the 1950s, very heavily. But that doesn't mean that they were not here and were not part of America's story. Communism is a stateless, moneyless society, so what is a communist country? We have no state. True. But they never could square that circle in communist societies, so they never could become moneyless or stateless, such as in the Soviet Union, America's great enemy during this Cold War. Andrew Jackson is indeed Mr. Trump's favorite president. He has a portrait of him in the Oval Office. This is a loser who couldn't graduate homeschool, knows nothing about history. Well, that's very sad. I'm very, very sad that you think that. I'm very, very sad that you've decided to spend your time wasting it listening to a supposed homeschooler who knows nothing about history, when it's very clear that I know quite a bit about history, probably a little bit more than you do. In fact, as Uncle Sam, I'm a representative of history itself. Do historians even know how many Indians lived in what is now considered the United States of America during the Columbus arrival to the New World? Is the estimate 1 to 2 million accurate? No, it was probably a lot more. You couldn't go on a two-year degree from a Mormon college. Well, yes, I couldn't go get a two-year degree from a Mormon college without first being asked to become the president of that college. You can keep asserting the founders wanted a Christian society, but that doesn't make it true. They wanted a society based on a particular set of moral and ethical values, and those indeed were the Christian values. They realized their society was 95% Christian, so advocating for anything else on the practical level wasn't good, and many of them were Christians, and the ones who weren't were perfectly okay with Christian values and morals. And deistic worldviews of the Enlightenment, which were espoused by Franklin and Jefferson, for instance, still were highly praiseworthy of the Judeo-Christian ethics of the past. They were, of course, derivatives in European philosophy from Christian values and morals. There's nothing wrong with saying that. That doesn't mean all the founding fathers were Christians. That doesn't mean that America is an expressly Christian nation. But it has historically and culturally been a Christian nation, and there is nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you have to be a Christian to be a great American. Look at Mr. Victor Berger, who was not a Christian, but was an extremely impressive American with everything he accomplished. He had a huge impact on America in a good way, and those losers at home can't. I don't know who you're talking about. Let me see. It is still not fundamentalist, meaning no one forces you to be Christian. Yes, it is not a fundamentalist Christian society, even, well, although there have been times where it has kind of drifted towards that. What was Douglas MacArthur's greatest accomplishment? The Incheon landing would probably be his greatest, where he actually went behind the lines of the North Koreans and invaded North Korea in order to save the South, which was pinched to the end near Busan during the Korean War. An incredible achievement and a very daring move from an already accomplished general. Let me say. Worships Trump, do I? Never said anything positive or negative about him during the live stream. I tend to be as objective as I possibly can about U.S. history. That is what the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel is known for. What was the worst thing Theodore Roosevelt did? Definitely his mistreatment of the natives, which was only multiplied during his presidency. Roosevelt once said, I don't think that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I am close to that perspective. Forcing them onto government schools where they were forced to read the Pledge of Allegiance, which we talked about earlier, Francis Bellamy's great oath, but also were slowly but surely had their cultural heritage stripped from them and were thrown onto the reservation system. Let me see. You just described Democrats. Okay, people are getting way too political. Why did the golfer wear 2 pairs of pants? In case he got a hole in one. Very funny. Very good. I'm not sure if this counts. William IV of England was there during the American Revolution. He wasn't king yet. He was the 3rd son. He was an admiral, a very accomplished admiral before he became king, and he was there, and I will allow that. He was the 3rd son of George III. And by the way, who was beloved by the British for many, many good reasons, and was probably a great monarch in his own right. Why do we never tell secrets about pizza? Because they're too cheesy. Yes, very, very funny. People do not realize if you are black and live in Palestine, you have to live in slave quarters. If you support Palestine, you support black slavery. I don't know if that's true. I've never heard that, and that doesn't have anything to do with American history, so why am I even bothering? Am I to believe we didn't have ethical standards before the Jewish and Christian gods were invented? No, that's not what I said. I am saying that America, the United States, in its founding, which we're talking about today, on its 250th birthday, which is why I, Uncle Sam, am visiting you today, and I want you to listen very closely to this, Mr. Grant, with a great presidential last name. Moral and ethical values have existed all throughout human history in every single civilization, but the one that heavily informed the Western world, the Angloid world, and the creation of the United States was the Judeo-Christian one. It was key to the Founding Fathers. It is not to say that no other morality exists anywhere else, or that Jews and Christians always act in the most moral of ways, because they oftentimes do not. Let me see. Let me see. Why can't the music teacher start his car? Because his keys are on the piano. Okay. What do you call a fake noodle? An impasta. Why did the Scarecrow win an award? Because he was outstanding in his field. Okay, yes, we've all heard these. Those are very nice. I'm sorry, I know you know it's your birthday. I won't time you out, but please, Harry. Okay, Uncle Sam, if you had to eliminate one color from our beautiful flag, like Survivor Island, which color? Ooh. I would put, that's a tough one to say, because the blue on the background for the stars doesn't seem to really fit much. I would get rid of the blue. Or I would change the white stripes to blue stripes, because we already have white stars. A white background for the stars doesn't make any sense. I know Palestine mostly because, okay, we need to move on to the history. We're not talking about history. We got the left, okay. I don't understand why my moderators, the moderators of this channel, have used so much of their time to ban people who are talking about things who are long-time, loyal, friendly neighborhood historians, while they are also allowing people to continue on with redundancies that have nothing to do with American history. Let us move forward into the history. Have a happy 4th, T25. We're happy that you're here. And I'm trying to catch up to the chat. I promise I will. So please be patient. I appreciate the patience you've shown me so far. Which American president was the most racist for the standard of his own time? Because I know with today's standard, here we go back more racist. Woodrow Wilson, Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. Those are some of the ones that stand out to me. Why is today's chat dominated by trolls who have no interest in history, only politics? Because for some reason, they've seemingly gotten a hold on the chat, and nobody has stopped them, but they've stopped other people who didn't deserve to be stopped. Let me see here. Then why didn't people blame the Black Panthers and Nation of Islam as much as the KKK? Because the movement for black separatism made more sense because of the horrible treatments that African Americans suffered and at the hands of people like the KKK. The KKK is the very cause as to why those separatist movements exist. The American government is just like a car. If you want to go forward, you put it in D, and if you want to go backwards, you put it in R. Okay, well, somebody made a joke about Democrats, so I guess it's fair for me to read that one. New Netherland was the colony the Dutch founded with the help of an Englishman, Henry Hudson, in the beginning of the 17th century, and that, of course, was seized by the English after the Second Anglo-Dutch War. There was natives involved, which led to the Creft War, so the Dutch actually fought against the natives. One of the groups of natives was known as the Manhattan, and that is why that island bears the name of where the original Indian residents were from. After the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the British seized that and turned it into New York. How did Ferdinand V and Isabella I react when Columbus told them that there was an entire new continent? He didn't believe it was a new continent. He believed it was India. It was Amerigo Vespucci who proved it wasn't. But they saw it as for the monetary advantages that they could get. Columbus didn't even make it past the West Indies. True, never landed in either North or South America or the country that bears his name. Would you agree that the U.S. landing on the moon is the coolest moment in U.S. history? Yes, I think that is fair. That is an incredible accomplishment that no one else has done. Almost everything else America has done, another great power has done. That is one thing that only America has done. John Jay fought against slavery. I don't know exactly. I believe he was against slavery. I'm trying to think. I believe he was a Northerner. So yes, I believe he was, as far as I know. Let me scratch my beard and think. There has never been one incident of racism in this beautiful country of Donald Trump's. I hope you're being sarcastic because there have been many. Even though it's not American history, what are the ramifications of a doctrine of discovery? Excuse me. I would you would need to explain what that is. I don't know what you are talking about. And again, we're focusing exclusively on American history for this 2-hour live stream, which we only usually go an hour on Saturdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. But today, we are in the presence of Uncle Sam. So, because of that, you get 2 hours instead of 1. My favorite episode is when America's moon landing and Wild West. Which one do you like more? Probably the moon landing. The Wild West is a little bit of an exaggeration. Other than the American Revolution, what's the best thing that happened for America? I would say it getting involved in both world wars in the 20th century allowed it to become a geopolitical hegemon that dominated politics and became the most powerful, without contest, in the world. Before then, the United States was one of the great powers. It was not the greatest. But to achieve that in such a record amount of time points to that Gilded Age Industrial Revolution that I talked about in the late 19th century that put America on par with many of the great powers of the West, like Germany, France, and England. Martin Luther King was sympathetic with communist ideas and principles and new communists. He was not a communist himself. What's blue? Okay, let me see. Can you expound on Spain financing the American Revolutionary War? Obviously, wanting to weaken a fellow rival in North America, the British, the Spanish helped the Americans. This did not prevent the Americans under Andrew Jackson from invading Florida later on and taking over. But yes, they funded them, the Dutch funded them, it was all to weaken the British. Obviously, the British had fought the Spanish multiple times for Florida, so this was a getting back at the British moment. And some people have said it could be a world war, but it obviously didn't include fighting in Asia or Africa. Were Chinese Americans great Americans? Yes, and unfortunately the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only immigration quota act of which there have been many in American history, targeted them specifically. So a horrible tragedy and a stain on the presidency of Chester Arthur. Teddy Roosevelt also supported lynching against Sicilians before he was president. Yes, heavily. As the governor of New York, he had a heavy bias against Italian Americans. I believe that's true. What caused counterculture movement, and what is the furthest left America was? America is far more to the right and far less socialistic than Europe, and definitely had some forms of social democracy and traditional liberalism throughout the 20th century, particularly between 1940 and 1970. But the truth of the matter is America probably is more politically left-wing now than it ever has been, especially when you consider one of the parties being more heavily, openly socialist than it has been before. The counterculture movement was caused partially by the Kennedy assassination, but also by a lack of trust in the American government and advocacy for free speech and rights and emancipation for women and other minorities, political minorities, that happened in the mid to late 1960s. And of course, a lot of people falling in love with rock and roll music and feelings of peace and love embraced that wholeheartedly and joined communes or became hippies of different stratus. There's really a spectrum. It's not one way or another, but they were known for their advocacy for the end of the war in Vietnam and also for their advocacy for rights for minorities and other peoples who were disenfranchised. Some of them became more extreme than others. And while there was plenty of liberalism and left-wing ideology in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, the FDR Truman days, and again during the time of the 1960s, America is probably more further to the left, at least officially politically today, than it was then. Why will American people never convert to the metric system? Because they'll never accept a foreign ruler. That is a good one. I'm getting tired of the puns, but yeah. Uncle Sam, between all the YouTubers, you choose Friendly History to visit us with. Well, I'm going to be on to several others later on. I have a long day ahead of me, and it's already 4:46. Let me see here. We're almost done. Almost done. We've got 15 more minutes, so please think of questions. Please like and subscribe. Please become a friendly neighborhood historian. I know that Friendly History would appreciate it, and so do I. I want you to sign up to this channel. How did the U.S. obtain the Oregon Territory? Did the Polk slogan 5440 or fight intimidate them? Yes, there was basically a possibility of a war. This was a campaign cry during the candidacy of James Knox Polk in 1844, and eventually the territory of the northwestern area of the Pacific, which had been debated for and kind of opened for settlement. There were American settlers and pioneers and travelers and traders in British Columbia, and there were tons of Brits in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. But eventually, the Treaty of Oregon in 1846 settled it along the 49th parallel, which is the modern border between Canada and the United States, with Washington and Oregon becoming part of the United States and British Columbia, of course, being retained by the British. Have you ever been to the Little White House or Sagamore Hill? No, I haven't, Bojack. I hope you have. History is intertwined with politics. There is some intertwining there, but I would like to stick mainly to the history. Can you tell me about blacklisting? Was it paranoid, witch hunting, or real? Both. There were many instances in which people being hunted didn't deserve to be hunted. And there were many instances where there was actually a real threat of communism in the United States, and the Soviet Union had sent spies during the last World War, during what I call World War III, or what you may call World War II. There was definitely a reasonable fear of that, and there is proof with Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs and things like that that show that it actually did happen. Let me see. Constantinople caused chain events. Yes, you could say that. The end of the Eastern Roman Empire could be connected. India landed on the moon in 2022. Did they? Did they really? Did they walk on the moon? Did they put their flag on the moon? I don't think so. And I'm not going to trust someone called your mom to say something that I've never even heard before. We shouldn't yes, an indirect thank you, I guess, might be in order to the Turks, except the United States fought a war against the Turks, the Great War. Hello, GK, good to see you, long time. Except for dropping the bombs in Japan, USA is the only country to use a nuclear weapon on real people. That's true. That is absolutely true. A very horrendous act, a very heavy and powerful act that ended the war at a very great cost. Racism in America ended after the Civil Rights Movement. As a historian, do you agree or disagree? Well, there's plenty of racism in America today. We've seen it in our own chat today. You could say that systematic racism ended with that, but that might not be true too. At the same time, racism is a battle that every human being must fight in the good or the evil of his heart. We all must reject notions of being greater than someone else just because of our physical appearance, be it racial or how good we look. Let me see. Fun fact, prior to 1776, California was thought by many to be an island. True. Then the Spanish settled it and colonized it and set up missions. What inspired Napoleon to sell Spain held many of the Southwest American states, but we don't see Spanish influence in American culture. Indirectly through Mexican culture, which has been partially inspired. Look at Catholicism, for instance, by Spain. Yes, it has. What inspired Napoleon to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States? He was funding his war with the British. He was wanting to build up enough of a force so he could land on the British Isles. He was also trying to push the continental system and continue fighting against the Austrians and the Prussians. So he sold the land to Thomas Jefferson, doubling the size of the United States for $15 million. Secretary of State James Madison, the future president, negotiated it, and future president, the last of the Virginian dynasty, James Monroe, was the emissary who worked with the French to secure that land that gave the United States New Orleans. It was originally supposed to be just the purchase of the port of New Orleans, then it became the purchase of Louisiana, then it became, which is obviously named after the King of France, and New Orleans is a French name, so there is a huge French influence actually, especially in the middle of a country in American history. We think of the United States in terms of the British in the east and the Spanish in the west, but the French were there too in the middle. And that obviously had been land that the French had gotten from the Spanish in previous wars, and so that land eventually was all purchased and double the size of the United States, and that was the territory explored by Lewis and Clark. And it looks like I have enough battery power on my cellular device, my little box here that does all sorts of wonders, to plug back in my microphone. Hopefully you are hearing me a little bit better now that I have my microphone back in, and we can keep that up for the rest of the time here. What do you think of Benjamin Harrison? Nice man, not the man America needed. Not a great president, not by any stretch. Unfortunately, the only grandson of another president, William Henry Harrison, to be president in his own right. The Harrisons were an incredible family. Harrison's great-grandfather, also named Benjamin, had signed, not this, the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrate today. It was signed on the 2nd. It was finished on the 28th. But it was officially approved on the 4th. And that is why we celebrate 250 years of American history on this day, America's semi-quincentennial, when it is halfway to 500 years old. The approval of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, at Carpenter's, later Independence Hall, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, written by Thomas Jefferson. It laid out grievances against the King of England. It declared the natural rights given by God, and it also advocated for a complete separation from the British Empire by the American colonies, the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. That also included, of course, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who had recommended Jefferson write it, and Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, who we never talk about. But those 5 men had written it, and it was signed first by the president, John Hancock, who put his large signature, his John Hancock, at the bottom of the Declaration, following by 54 other individuals. And that's the story of the Declaration of Independence. Let me see here. Why do Native Americans hate April? Okay. What do you believe are the top 3 worst things America has done to its own citizens? Very good question there, definitely. I think Japanese internment, slavery, and I'm trying to think of one more. Japanese internment, slavery, and Jim Crow. Those 3 are definitely there. What is the funniest event in American history you can think of, like comedy? Ooh, what's funny? Ooh, there's lots of funny things that have happened in American history. I think Theodore Roosevelt getting shot and giving his speech is pretty impressive. There's a little bit of humor in that. There's a lot of irony in Theodore Roosevelt, obviously, a man who resigned his own cabinet position to fight in a war, but then later negotiated peace and won a Nobel Peace Prize. Fascinating individual, by the way. Humor. I'm trying to think of good comedy in American history. That would be, I think that Theodore Roosevelt stories fill me with good humor. So that would be the closest I could think of right now. Thank you for joining us from New Zealand, another Angloid country like the United States. Thank you, Metal Monkey. It's good to see you. Who built the pyramid in Poverty, Louisiana, and how long has it been there? I don't know about it that much. Can't say much behind the seal. Sorry. But it's interesting to have a pyramid, obviously inspired by the Egyptians. Emperor Norton is funny. Now, Emperor Norton was an eccentric who was saluted by all of the soldiers in San Francisco and rented his own little room, which he converted and called his own little empire. So he was the emperor of the United States, and he had been a military officer. He was an eccentric. He was well known among the town for going around and always giving out little charitable donations, especially to children. And he was always saluted by the soldiers as the emperor of the United States, a fascinating little man in the 1850s and 60s. What era in American history the society was the furthest right and hasn't been in its history? What era was it the furthest left? Interestingly enough, I would say, again, American society has moved to the left generally in the last 10 years, more so than previously, where socialism and social democracy have become more acceptable and popular for various different reasons. Ironically, America was probably farthest to the right in the 1980s during the Reaganomics days. Is there, although you could say, if you see the right wing as the tradition, as holding on to old sacred traditions for better or for worse, that the American system really was conservative at many different periods. Perhaps the American founding is very conservative. Many have argued the conservatism and tradition and right-wing leaning ideas of the American Revolution. There's a possibility that you could say that America was more right-wing during the time of Andrew Jackson or things like that, when there definitely were a lot of nativist pro-American sentiments. But that might be a question of when was America its most patriotic, which would be almost impossible for me to answer. Is there any correlation between the Spanish Revolution and the American Revolution? Which Spanish Revolution are you referring to? Our Spanish Civil War? Not necessarily. There have been revolutions in American history. Oh, my hat's getting a little itchy. It's very hot out here in the United States these days. The global warming is just terrible. We didn't have this in the 1790s, or the 1810s for that matter. Yes, there were, I don't know if there's a correlation. There were many Americans who went and helped the Spanish. And of course, the Americans started Spanish revolutions in Cuba and Puerto Rico, the Spanish-American War. They started revolutions in former Spanish countries like Colombia, leading to the creation of Panama. What do you think of Henry Ford? A brilliant and incredible inventor, very retrograde in many of his beliefs, and sympathetic to the Nazis is kind of a turnoff, but the man who created not just the reliable commercial, readily available motor car, but created the system in which to create that, which is the assembly line, which obviously led to to specialization of labor and an increase of wages. Ford basically created the modern took the modernized factory industrial system and made it 10 times better, and created specialization of labor on a rate that had never existed before and created the mass production and sale of cars on a level that had never been seen before. And no, I am not related to Sam Houston. We just happen to have the first name. But Sam Houston was the great American general and governor and president of Texas multiple times during its history, who led the Texas Revolution, led the Texas Republic, and then served as its governor and a senator from there during America. And he did not secede from the United States during the Civil War. The Salem witch hunts. A little bit exaggerated, especially when you consider the context that the Europeans were far more deleterious and calamitous in their witch hunts and far more accusatory. But obviously, the part of the witch hunt was the suspicion of the devil by Puritans in New England, the same people who had set up the colony at the beginning of the 17th century, were fearful that it was riddled with witches by the end of that century. And so they set out on the witch hunts, believing that women from Elizabeth Bishop on downwards, including the slave woman Tituba, were all different types of witches, probably because girls were suffering from epileptic seizures and they didn't know better back then. This also became an excuse for people to settle disputes, political rivalries, and social feuds with one another by accusing one another of being witches. 22 people were killed, which is a horrific number. It's a terrible story. It's extremely spooky, and there really was no witchcraft going on that's been proven. But at the same time, you must consider that the real spell that was set in Salem was the spell of social contagion and false accusation, which is why something where people are falsely being accused of something just to be destroyed is called a witch hunt to this day. Of course, Arthur Miller during the McCarthy days likened the blacklisting to the Salem witch hunt in The Crucible. Do you think that Nagasaki was necessary? It seems as if, unfortunately, despite the terrible losses of life at both events, that both Nagasaki and Hiroshima were necessary to end the war. The Japanese were not about to end that war. Please don't get mad at me for asking this. If it is the North that was colonized for religious reasons, then how come the North is less religious than the South? The North has become more secularized than the South and become more politically liberal than the South. The Southern colonies were colonized for economic reasons, but they had, the Northern colonies, particularly New England, was colonized for religious reasons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they would stay that way. That was 4 centuries ago. At the same time, almost all of these people were extraordinarily religious by any stretch of the imagination. The South tends to be more religious because of heavy religious devotions from African Americans and white Southerners. It is a good question. Are you supposed to be Uncle Sam if he was beautiful? Yes, if he was gorgeous. As George Washington said, I'm not ugly, I'm gorgeous. Is it true that, and you can listen to Friendly History, analyze some history memes, including that one, that debuted yesterday, and you can hear him read the Declaration of Independence, that debuts today at 8 p.m. Eastern. Is it true that Jefferson wrote the Constitution on the back of the Declaration of Independence to save paper? That's very humorous, but no. Jefferson and Adams were not involved in the writing of the Constitution, despite being such influential Americans. Jefferson was the ambassador to France at the beginning of its revolution, by the way, and Jefferson was the ambassador to Great Britain at the time. So, anyways, okay. Hopefully, I am sorry for the volume drop, but hopefully now things are okay. Obscura is here. We've got more members. Harry hates US. Why don't you feel the same way about the UK? Because I don't have to hate one country to love another one. And there are many great things about the United Kingdom. And in truth, the United States would not be what it is without the British. And the British are an impressive and incredible people. And the vast majority of American history has been shaped mainly by Angloid people. Let me see. Was Thomas Paine a traitor to his country? In some ways, yes, but more so a lover of a new country, of a new experiment in America, and that's why he wrote Common Sense and What Is to Be Done. No, that's a Marxist. That's Maxim Gorky. I forget the name of the other document he wrote. But Washington had it actually. It was so influential that not just Common Sense, but the follow-up to Common Sense, in which Paine urged the Americans to join the revolutionary cause following the events of the Declaration of Independence, that Washington had it distributed and given to his troops. This encouraged patriots, people who were supportive of the American cause, to join, and encouraged more people who were on the fence to become patriots. There were about a third of Americans at the beginning of the war were patriots, supporting the revolutionary cause, either actively or discreetly, or more subtly. About a third were loyalists, loyal to the British Empire and the British Crown, and about another third were neutral. And things like Common Sense helped influence more people to become patriots and to help the American cause. Paine later went on to support the French cause and was one of the more radical political thinkers of his day. Slaves weren't American citizens, period. That question was what was done to American citizens? The slaves, as soon as slavery was over, received American citizenship. So you have Japanese internment, you have Jim Crow laws, and you have exclusion of immigration would be another great one, but that doesn't include American citizens. I'm trying to think of other ones. You have some sort of more bizarre things like the Tuskegee experiments. That was done to American citizens. You have the draft. You could argue the draft is a form of mistreatment and abuse that Americans suffered. Are you going to hop in VC after the live stream? I don't know what that means. Let me see. But I hope you all have an incredible 4th of July and celebrate America's founding and go out to some great parades and barbecues and picnics. Maybe you already have done so. Maybe you're going to be doing so soon. I hope you all enjoy that and stay safe out there. And use the knowledge you've learned today to impress your friends when you're watching the fireworks. And enjoy the fireworks shows and all the incredible displays as America celebrates its semi-quincentennial, its 250th birthday. I'm Uncle Sam. We've gone over 2 hours now, but I'm going to stay here because I have more questions to answer. And I once again have to plug in my particular device, it seems. But I'm going to, but you don't have to go anywhere because there's still more history to come. I'm going to catch up to the chat. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. I apologize for any delays. I apologize for any tech issues. And we're going to get everything squared away before we sign off. So here we go with the lightning round. Is William Shakespeare part of American history? He's influential on American literature, obviously. Shakespeare's plays are very popular in the United States, even to this day. They're read in almost every high school, but no. Emperor Norton was famous in San Francisco and literally had his own money, which was accepted by locals as legal tender. Yes, lovable man. What was the funniest U.S. president joke? I'd say when someone told Coolidge, I bet you can say 3 words. Yep, Coolidge responded with, you lose. He was known as Silent Cal, but he gave a bunch of radio press talks because radio was the popular medium of the day and was brand new. And this, again, was a time when American products, technology, like the assembly line, were kicking in, and a consumer culture was being born at a high rate. What is the funniest? Okay, let me see here. Okay, this might be a weird question. If American democracy has its roots in Magna Carta, is Magna Carta part of U.S. history and should be taught? It's part of the background. These are not American history. So stop trying to take it and make it about things that are not American history. You're trying to stretch the bounds of the Q&A, and I really don't appreciate that. Uncle Sam certainly doesn't appreciate that. American history really starts 1776 is the start of America. American history starts in the colonial period. The British colonies are the beginning of that, so in the 17th century. You can also set up the background by talking about Columbus and the settlements. That's very generous to go back to 1492. Things before then might have been influential, such as the fall of Constantinople or the creation of the Magna Carta. In fact, Jesus dying on the cross and supposedly rising from the dead is influential in the development of Western Christianity and Western thought, which is obviously is influential in American history. So you're trying to stretch this a little bit too far, I think. I think you're a little too big for your britches. The truth of the matter is, American history does go back to, it does have its roots in European history, which is huge and has lasted much, much longer. But that doesn't mean that the Magna Carta is an American history. It is influential in the development of the British legal and political system, which obviously influences the American system, but it is not American history. I'm native to Texas, so I get both the best words. I get to be Hispanic, but also I'm living in an ancestral homeland and I'm super American. That's very cool, Noodler. So I've talked a lot about the history of Texas and about the history of America, the Mexican-American War, and about Mexico's history. You are a Tejano, and we appreciate you being here. Do other countries have fraud scams as big as U.S. or its American feature? Don't know. Every country has had fraud and scandal, and some countries have it very systematically. They're called kleptocracies. It seems like global warming is real. Look at the heat waves in Europe and in the United States. What is your overall opinion of George Rogers Clark? Wasn't he one of the generals during the American Revolution? Don't know much about him. Good general from what I remember. Wasn't he the one who was fighting in the Western territories? They do, but they can't afford it like us, so it's a bigger problem and more noticeable. Fair. I am a patriotic Merlin. I'm Uncle Sam, not Sam Houston. In American history, have there ever been anyone who believed that the earth is flat? Not from what I remember. Maybe some whack nut jobs on the internet who have gone a little bit eccentric, a little bit too far, a little bit like an unlovable Emperor Norton. Let me see. And I appreciate that, GK. I really appreciate that. If you're liking the live, please double tap the screen like GK has and subscribe. Liking also helps. Commenting on all the videos and content that Friendly Neighborhood History has put out helps the algorithm. So please give him a little bit of a hand up and check out the long-form videos such as the American History Means and the reading of the Declaration of Independence that will be out by 8 p.m. today. Can you talk about the history of socialism in America? Talked about it a little bit. Eugene Debs ran for president 7 different times. Socialism is born out of the populist movement and obviously is influenced by Marxism and the development for Fabian socialism and utopianism during the 19th century, which comes over from Europe to the United States and is influential. There is a nonviolent side of it, which leads to the creation of a socialist party, or the Social Democratic Party. People like Upton Sinclair and John Steinbeck were members of this, or at least supporters of it, and of course Eugene V. Debs, who I mentioned before. And there was the IWW, the International World Workers, who were the more violent, anarchic, communistic side of that, which were agitators in things like the Haymarket riots and things and other things like that. And there was actually a divide between the more anarchic communists and who were more violent and the socialists in America. And Victor Berger spoke to this. So there you go, the history of socialism. Of course, socialism has seen a revived interest with many wanting America to become more of a social democracy on the political left. And like I said before, America is far more to the right than most European countries. What was the importance of the Know Nothing Party prior to the Civil War? The first major nativist party that advocated for the reduction of immigration, which is a topic that seems to continue to be popular even unto this day, and definitely was popular during the great waves of immigration. Between 1925 and 1965, despite its warm and welcoming history towards immigrants, the United States has welcomed in more than any other country in the world, and is a nation of immigrants in many, many ways and shapes and forms. There was a huge quota system placed on immigrants, with only special exceptions made, such as immigrants from North Korea or Taiwan, or from China, things like that, or from Eastern Europe and Western Europe at the end of the last World War. But there were quota systems between 1925 and 1965. Only certain numbers of people from certain countries could come in at different times during that 40-year span. That was overturned in 1965, and ever since then, America has been trying to figure out what to do with its immigrants. But America has had a troubled and sometimes toxic relationship with immigrants, but has also welcomed immigrants, brought them in, and given them incredible achievements. And immigrants have made a huge difference in America, both before, during, and after its founding. Think of Friedrich von Steuben, an immigrant who helped strengthen Washington's forces at Valley Forge. I'm trying to remember the Polish general who basically created the American cavalry. He was an immigrant. The Marquis de Lafayette and John Paul Jones were immigrants who came over and helped the United States during its time of need in creating the actual system, in winning the American Revolution. Because if you don't win the American Revolution, none of this happens. There's no Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence is a treasonous writ and a death sentence, a death warrant for people like Franklin and Jefferson. So the Know Nothing Party was a nativist party. It was led by former American President Millard Fillmore in the 1856 election. It actually won some electoral votes and basically advocated for heavy nativism and Western expansionism, and was called the American Independent Party, but is known as the Know Nothings because when they were asked about it, they were very secretive and would say they knew nothing. Was turkey almost our national bird? Yes, Franklin wanted it to be the national bird. To write this 250 years ago, Simone saw the future. Good. I'm glad the sound is better. Hopefully it's still okay, even after I have to unplug it. What was the first nation that U.S. started diplomatic relationships other than England? No, it wasn't the UK. It was France, the Dutch, and the Netherlands during the war. Let me see. Thank you, Handy. I'm glad you were here. Thank you for the super chat. Did more slaves actually come from the Caribbean islands than thought of, or did they actually come from Africa? Most of the slaves came from Africa and were settled in the Caribbean, but more slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America than to the United States or Canada. Were people in the 1770s smarter for today? People are about as smart. They have generally more people on average live longer. They have more access to education, and IQ tests will score better on IQ tests than people from back then. That doesn't mean that those people were stupid. It just means access to technology and education and better resources have made people do better with standardized testing. Are people really dying in France out of heat exhaustion? Why won't they put air conditioning in? There's environmental concerns. There's usage concerns. You don't need to use it nearly as much as the Americans do. So there's a lot of questions and prohibitions and worries about emissions and environmental damage. But again, that's not really a U.S. history question. Did John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, have a big influence on American culture? Yes, but not as big as we'd like to think. Obviously, he sets up this political speech of calling America a shining city on a hill, and basically devises this idea by which many Americans, through the centuries, have lived with. That America should be this incredible, remarkable bastion of freedom and opportunity, serving its God. It's a very religious, politically religious symbol advocated by somebody who was not an advocate of a democratic republic that the founders created. But that vision has been appealed to on multiple occasions in order to provide hope and future for America, that America can be a light, a shining city on a hill for the people of the rest of the world. So it's really his speech that makes it. And of course, him bringing about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and it surviving is the huge story. Uncle Sam, when in the American history was Americans the happiest? I don't know. Probably sometime in the 1950s. Let me see. Is Barack Obama the most famous black American or MLK? Ooh, that's a tough one. I would say MLK, but you don't underlook great African Americans like Madam C.J. Walker, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and all the incredible accomplishments they did. Uncle Sam, is Friendly History glad I came to the stream? I'm sure he'll be very thrilled to when I meet with him later. When we have a little bit of American beer and we talk about how the live stream went. Can you talk a little bit about how Hawaii became a U.S. state? Sanford Dole basically, along with other business interests, overran the territory and made it so that only landowners could vote in the next elections. They overthrew Queen Lualua Kalani, the last native ruler of Hawaii, and in the local election, they elected Dole basically the leader of the territory, and he appealed to the United States to annex them, which President McKinley, anxious to help build an American empire and put America on the world stage, did so. This is right around the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And that is how Hawaii became part of the United States. Speaking of somebody mentioning President Obama being their favorite president, he is, of course, from Hawaii, the only American president from Hawaii. Was Baron von Steuben's particular ways, I hope you understand, overlooked by all Revolutionary Officer Corps? No, they were adopted in part because they were new drill techniques that were very useful for the American soldiers. Washington realized that in order to beat the British, you had to fight like the British, and the Americans were good at guerrilla warfare, particularly in the South, where they used it like Daniel Morgan, Francis Marion, and the like there. But at the same time, in actual combat on the field, in actual battles, you needed to be able to be disciplined and follow the drill methods of the actual European style at the time, which was to march straight in a line, line up your muskets and fire until as many men as possible fell down, get pretty close, and then charge at each other and use bayonets to finish the jobs. Let me see here. And since Hawaii is not in the continental America, should we rename the country to the United States of Earth? No. America is not, the Americas refers to the Caribbean as well. Who are you supposed to be? I am Uncle Sam. Let me see. Let's keep going. Where did American cheese come from? Wisconsin, most likely. That's the cheese state. Is it true that Iroquois Nation had a huge impact on shaping U.S.? There was some influence in the Iroquois Confederacy and how they had kind of a semi-republican form of government. Obviously, they were seen as savages and oftentimes enemies, but the Iroquois had been allies to the British during the 7 Years' War, and actually, if I'm correct, helped the British during the American Revolution. So the Americans weren't huge fans of them, but Benjamin Franklin made overtones to their incredible forms of government, and that is where we get the idea that the Iroquois Confederacy directly influenced the creation of the Republic and the Constitution, but is probably not the case. I had chocolate stout during this Q&A. Oh, that's a good one. Very delicious. Very, very delicious. Is Texas the only U.S. state that joined U.S. on its own will? California also technically did that. But again, both of them were annexed, so it's not fully on their own will. To have their own independent republics, Texas and California. And Hawaii, kind of. The British and the French were our allies. The British wanted us to win so badly they would get access to that sweet slave cotton. I don't know if that's true, Robert E. Lee. Respect you on the battlefield, don't respect your takes. No offense. And look at that, we actually did catch up to the chat. Only over 200,000 German immigrants fought for the North. That's true. The Germans were the most populous immigrant group at that time, second to only the Irish, who came later. So it was the Germans first, then the Irish, then the Italians, Italians, Greeks, Jews, Eastern Europeans, and in the West it was the Chinese and then the other groups of Asians until the quota system came in 1925. Why did the... Okay, let me see. The British, let me see. And yes, I am Uncle Sam. Why did the term Cotton's King catch on? Cotton is King was the cornerstone of the American Southerners' economic and social policy. Again, the Civil War was because of slavery. Even though there were economic, regional, social, and political differences between North and South, the South wanted to preserve their way of life, and their ways of life, socially, politically, and economically, were undergirded and cornerstoned by slavery. So cotton is king because cotton was the main export, obviously harvested by the slaves. Would Washington be proud of him of who? Uncle Sam? Yes, I suppose. Why did Karl Marx glaze Lincoln so much? Marx did not have a high opinion of African Americans, but Marx and subsequent Marxists have had great respect for the American Revolution seeing it as a bourgeois revolution on the way to creating a socialist state in the United States. I don't know that Marx really did love Lincoln that much, though. Do you appreciate someone having Robert E. Lee profile picture? I understand why people would like Robert E. Lee. It's understandable, although he did become a traitor. Let me see. Would Uncle Sam is friendly history, glad I can stream. I already said I believe that he would be. Was the Civil War fought over the South paying more taxes than the North and because the North passing bills to keep the South from selling goods to the Europe, or was it really just over slavery? It was over slavery. Again, there were other issues too, but most regional, which means the North was based on the factory system, which made it more populous, which made it more industrial, which is why they won the war in the first place. They had the better industry and more men available, despite the South fighting a defensive war and relying on its great generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. The truth of the matter is, my dear friends, that the North had the moral high ground and eventually had to go deep into the South and uproot and destroy much of its infrastructure to get rid of its old societal ways, including that of slavery. So the antebellum South was concentrated on slavery. So the Civil War was about slavery. Not only was it made a major issue, was it a major issue at the beginning of the war, it was made even more major by the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln after the Battle of Antietam in 1862, and it becoming an official executive order in January of 1863, freeing slaves in the Confederate areas, including on June 19, 1865 in Galveston, Texas, which is why the Americans celebrate Juneteenth to this day. But at the same time, is also all the subsidiary reasons that are sometimes cited by lost cause myth nonsense and people who advocate that, that the South had a particular way of doing things, a particular society, economy, and region that they were trying to preserve, that states' rights were being violated. It was all based on the right to own and practice slavery for their economic and social benefits. So Robert E. Lee was not the son-in-law of George Washington. I think he might have been related to him indirectly. Was the Civil War... Okay, I already answered that. Let me see. Is it true that Thomas Jefferson was alive during the Civil War? No. Died much later. The North had a lot of money invested in the South. True. Especially after the war. Happy Independence Day, Shuriken. I'm so glad that you showed up. Friendly History will be glad to see you. And I, Uncle Sam, am very, very glad that you showed up to the live stream. Let me see here. I'm going to plug in my microphone one last time because I'm going to catch up to the chat and then we're going to wrap it up. We've gone 16 minutes, much longer than we anticipated. But we promised a 2-hour live stream of Uncle Sam, and I was happy to deliver. Yes, the state's rights to own slaves. Exactly. That's the rights that they were fighting for. They believed Lincoln was going to take away their slaves. They didn't believe him when he said he wouldn't. Let me see. If Eli Whitney had never invented the cotton gin, would slavery have dissolved itself in the South? Most likely, but Whitney actually invented it hoping that using a machine would make it much less prudent to have slaves, but the Southerners just put the slaves onto the machines. It's very sad, actually. The founders and Whitney were astounded because the founders believed that slavery would die out. They didn't believe that a civil war was necessary and they believed that dividing the nation over slavery would lead to civil wars and was not necessary. They had already fought a war to divide themselves from the British. They didn't want to be divided anymore, and another civil war would have divided the nation even more. So that's why they didn't abolish slavery right away. They also believed slavery would probably die out within a couple of generations. It took a giant war. It was so entrenched in the society of the South. They had no idea, neither did Abraham Lincoln, even during the Civil War, how entrenched it was in Southern society. Let me see. Yes, Uncle Sam has always been depicted with very long legs. Lincoln grew beard because of a little girl. Yes, she wanted him. She thought he'd be better looking with it. He looked too thin without it. It's a very funny story. That's another cute little funny story in American history. He actually met her, but they had been pen pals for a while, and she said that he looked ugly without the beard. Yes, I've done a video on that. Friendly History has, at least. George Washington was the step-great-grandfather-in-law. Yeah, something like that. Thank you, obscure reference. 3 out of the first presidents died on July 4th. Yes, 3 of the first 5. Jefferson and Adams, 50 years after they, who had both written the Declaration, signed it, and I'm going to have to plug in my phone again. The cellular device is confusing and confounding to Mr. Sam. To Mr. Samuel Wilson of New York. Anyways, yes. And James Monroe, the 5th president, died on July 5th, 1831, but Adams and Jefferson, who had both written it, died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after. They had been long-term frenemies and political opponents, but apparently Adams' last words was, "Jefferson still lives," even though Jefferson had died earlier that day. This is obviously before you had the internet, so you could find things out so quickly. Is it only American history questions? Yes, today it has been, Benny, and we're wrapping it up, but it's good to see you. The Sons of Liberty were a semi-terrorist organization of patriots who, again, not all patriots were like this, but the patriots were those who, not just a football team, but were those who advocated for the free liberation of themselves from the British. Well, not initially. At first, they just wanted better rights and better treatment and for the British to not tax them without representation, which was the whole cause of the American Revolution in the first place. Later on, they became far more militant and aggressive, and much more open and interested in the ideas of freeing America from the British. They were the ones who tarred and feathered, by the way, and committed the Boston Tea Party. Lighthorse Henry Lee was related to Robert E. Lee. What did Lighthorse accomplish? Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, he was one of Washington's secretaries and closest friends. He was a colonel of the American cavalry during the American Revolution, if I'm correct. Mason-Dixon line was drawn long before the Civil War, though, to be fair, Robert E. Lee. They were two European astronomers who came over and set the line between the Southern and free states. I don't know about their flag. I think Samuel Adams or Paul Revere designed it. Those were the two leading Sons of Liberty. There's also the Daughters of Liberty, a women's organization that also advocated for American rights and independence. At first, it was, again, about getting better treatment from the British, and eventually it morphed into the American Revolution. No one could have foreseen the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution when this movement began in the 1760s, when the British started taxing without the consent of the governed. As I mentioned before, it wasn't that the taxes were too heavy. It was that they were too invasive of the rights of the American people, who were used to paying taxes to the British in an indirect way. The word patriot changed in its meaning. You could say that, yes. Patriot was the official title given to those who supported the American Revolutionary cause at different phases and different stages as it became more and more aggressive. Let me see here. What do you think changed the most about the first 20 presidents versus the past 25 presidents or so? James Garfield would be the 20th, so that'd be the cutoff. Obviously, America became a rich and international nation, and really, I think the demarcation belongs with Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. Presidents became far more central public figures, far more powerful in the 20th century. There are exceptions, but the vast majority of presidents in the 20th and into the 21st century have believed in the imperial presidency, the power of the president to get things done as the main representative of America, not Congress, the president. And Lincoln and Washington probably had this in some way, shape, or form, but creating the imperial presidency from the bully pulpit of Theodore Roosevelt on down through the modern point has been something that separates the early presidents from the later ones, Benny. Let me see. This is going to be my last question, but what do you think of both of Grover Cleveland's terms? First one was far more successful than the second one. He was kind of out of touch by the time he came back in 1893. And maybe that's because he was elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. Who knows? Again, will history repeat itself with Donald Trump? Again, who knows? Would his first term be more successful? Who knows? Thomas Paine did not own slaves. That's true. He wasn't an American. What was the shortest conflict America did? In terms of scale, large scale, probably the Spanish-American War. There were several wars with the Indians that lasted only a few weeks. Why was President John Tyler so useless and boring as president? He basically just defied the Whigs whenever he wanted to, and refused to sign a national bank, and just showed that he was a closet Democrat, and was seen as a traitor by the Whigs, so he became the man without a party. His whole cabinet resigned, or he fired them, and he basically did not follow along and toe the party line, and didn't do anything to make overtones to the party that had gotten him to vice presidency and then accepted him to become president after Harrison died. There was no chain of succession at that time for the president. The vice president just kind of moved into that with John Tyler. Tyler wasn't boring. He was very aggressive. He brought Texas into the Union, and he could constantly buck the Whigs, so much so that they obviously dropped him from the party. Let me see. I'm really glad you enjoy the streams. I really appreciate you. Could 13 colonies just remove taxes and not become independent? They tried to. The Olive Branch petition was the last effort by the First Continental Congress, but the British were not willing, and the Americans had crossed a lot of lines with the British. We don't look at the British perspective today because we're celebrating America, but really the British had tried on many occasions to make overtones and work out the differences between them and the Americans. We don't want to be too harsh on the British as well. Remember, America has done a lot is a lot of what it is today because of the British. Let me see here. Was there anything else in 1770s that could lead to very different alternative history? There's plenty, but haven't you asked me enough? I'm serious. The Olive Branch petition could have been approved, I suppose. Again, there's been a lot that we've talked about today. We've gone 2 hours and 20 minutes, and we've answered a lot, and I've discussed a lot about the American Revolution. Don't skate around slavery, Robert. Every state except for Florida and Arkansas cited slavery as the principal cause for leaving the Union. Yep, exactly. Did Friendly Neighborhood History talk about me or no? No, he didn't say anything. Panama was there in 89. True. Who was the most boring U.S. president? Boring in terms of his presidency was not particularly wonderful or terrible and just kind of there. He doesn't die in office. That's a good question. James Monroe's is actually kind of boring. John Quincy Adams, I would say, is the most boring, though. Stonewalled by Andrew Jackson, he really didn't get that much done, but his American system was really good for the infrastructure of the United States and helped pave the way for the pioneer days of the 1830s. You can't have Jacksonian democracy without the American system that was basically just borrowed by Jackson from Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. Wars with indigenous were genocides, not war. Well, they were successful military campaigns that conquered land from the natives that the natives had conquered from other natives. They were not genocides. And I think Theodore Roosevelt is the most exciting. Does the title Commander-in-Chief have anything to do with respect for natives? No, it is the leader of the American Army because it is a position, the United States President is a position based completely on George Washington. Why does communism fail every time? Dictatorial totalitarian socialism, aka communism, fails because it does not properly it seeks to force people to be equal and not recognize the uniqueness in individuals. That seems to be the most likely reason that it fails on a social basis. It also fails because it is heavily, heavily, heavily hated by non-communist entities such as the United States. And there's not much American history there, this is an American history stream today. We usually answer questions about all sorts of history, and Friendly History loves to talk about all different types of history. But today, he wanted me to focus only on American history, so as Uncle Sam is the mascot of this nation, it was my pleasure to do so. What was the greater victory during the Civil War, Gettysburg or Vicksburg? Well, Vicksburg is underrated, and that happened on July 4th, 1863. Unconditional surrender, U.S. Grant, Uncle Sam Grant. Sam was his nickname. He's named after me. Ulysses S. Grant, who later became president, won a huge victory at Vicksburg, basically dividing the South in twain and ruining the chances of the western part of the South, like Mississippi and Texas, from unifying and helping their brothers in North and South Carolina, for instance. It's a huge victory. He only accepted their unconditional surrender, so U.S. Grant, United States, Uncle Sam Grant. Sam was his nickname, and of course he used that, and then Lincoln used that to justify making him commander of the Union Army. He crushed Lee eventually, and then became the U.S. president. Is Uncle Sam a rabid anti-communist? Yes, like most Americans, I have a lot of problems with communism. Some Americans don't know why, but I do. Oklahoma against transgender? What? And happy 4th of July to you. American values are inherently anti-communist? Yes. There's a lot about American enterprise and individualism and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and all of these things that are stereotypically American that just don't work with communism. Although there have been communists in American history because America has had the freedom to allow for political expression, they have been oppressed on many different occasions. But the Communist Party still exists in the United States to this day. During the 1812 war, the Brits did not actually burn the White House. Yes, they did. They did set fire to the White House, which is why James Madison was forced to live in the Octagon. Stephen Decatur's home, I believe was the name of the man, in Washington with Dolly until he left office in 1817. All right. Okay. We have caught up to the chat. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. Were there Jewish Americans during the Civil War? Yes, there have been Jews all throughout American history. I don't know why your question got removed, but yes. She saved the painting of George Washington with the help of a slave, the famous painting by Gilbert Stuart that you probably have all seen and loved. All right, well, 1 hour and 2 hours and 27 minutes, and not the longest live stream, I believe, that Friendly History has ever done, but subbing in for him was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you like and subscribe on your way out the door, that you enjoy your 4th of July, that you celebrate America for all of its failings. We wish a happy birthday to our moderator, Harry. We hope that you check out all of the content of Harsonet's channel, where he does all sorts of U.S. history edits. And we hope you look into all the history and social studies, American and otherwise, that Friendly Neighborhood History is happy to deliver to you 24/7, 365 days a year. And I will be sure to say hello to him when I see him later, as he will be celebrating his 4th of July and hopes that you will be too. And we wish you all a very happy 4th of July, a happy birthday to the United States, and in many ways, I guess it's my birthday too, because I am Uncle Sam, and I am a representative of these great United States. We went from 13 to 50, and who knows where we'll go next. Let me see. I hope you all did take care. Have a great rest of your day. And Friendly History will be back for the live stream lecture about the American founding tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, so please check that out. And every live stream is Friday and Saturday at 6 and 3 p.m. Eastern, where he answers all of your questions about history or social studies in hopefully a friendly, neighborly manner. Take care, and as always, as he likes to say, love history. This is Uncle Sam wishing you a very happy 4th of July and a happy birthday to America, and thank you for Roz for the super chat. God bless you all, and God bless America.